The frost presses against the windows first, not the kind that simply chills, but the kind that waits heavy, patient, almost alive. Then comes the scent: burning pine, wet stone, and the faint metallic tang of ice. Windsor Castle, at the heart of winter, a palace that breathes and remembers, long after the world has gone still. Somewhere beyond the east wing, a servant mutters a prayer under her breath. Another coughs, the sound echoing against stone so cold it seems to swallow it. Footsteps scrape across the frozen floor, followed by the subtle metallic click of keys unlocking doors no one dares enter. The frost clings like a promise, each crystal weighing on the soul, sharp and persistent, refusing to let go. It is the winter of the mid-Victorian age, a kingdom proud and measured, yet fragile beneath the weight of snow. The same halls that once rang with laughter now tremble with silence. The same hands that held quills now clutch candlelight against draughts that could kill. In the corridors and chambers, they call it the Queen's coldest Christmas, when even royalty cannot command warmth, and grief drifts as heavily as snow. They said it was merely a season, they said it was a storm. But winter has memory, and silence waits for no one. Frost creeps through veins of stone and heart alike, whispering of nights that will not end. So tonight, keep your lantern low and your breath slow, because this is where it began, the Queen's coldest Christmas, when ice ruled the halls, and even candlelight seemed to hesitate. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more halls to wander, more shadows to follow, and more winters that have not yet ended. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The cold is never as far away as it seems. The frost came sooner than anyone expected. Not the gentle lace that paints the hedgerows by dawn, but a hard, unbending kind that turned earth to iron and air to glass. One morning in early December, Windsor woke beneath a silence so deep it felt alive. Every field between the castle and the river gleamed white, and the frozen Thames stretched like a sheet of dull pewter, unbroken as far as the eye could see. Even the birds had gone. The sky hung low and heavy, colourless, pressing down upon the kingdom as though winter itself had taken the throne. Inside the castle, the servants moved slower than usual. The brass doorknobs burned their fingers. The linens cracked as they folded them. Water froze in the basins before they could be poured into the kettles. Somewhere in the upper halls, a maid's cry echoed, a bucket split apart from the cold, the wood snapping like bone. The air was cruel even indoors. Fires hissed and smoked but gave little warmth. Every breath hung visible. Every whisper came out as mist. The castle groaned, its stone contracting with the night. Down in the courtyard, a thin snow had drifted over the cobblestones, smoothing the world into silence. Footmen shuffled, with sacks of coal, their faces red and raw beneath scarves turned stiff with frost. Horses shivered in the stables, their breath pluming like ghosts. Above them, Windsor's towers loomed sharp, rimed, and glittering as though sculpted from the very winter that surrounded them. The Union Jack, frozen mid-wave, clung to its pole like an old soldier refusing to surrender. At the heart of the castle, the Queen's apartments were dimly lit, the windows covered with thick damask curtains to keep out the draught. Yet even here, the frost had found a way in. It crept along the edges of the glass, etching fern-like patterns that shimmered in the candlelight. On a small writing desk, beside an inkwell gone solid with cold, sat a folded letter tied in black ribbon, his handwriting still visible beneath the years. Albert. Victoria sat before the hearth in silence. The fire spat and cracked, throwing little warmth, its embers glowing like half-dead stars. Her hands were clasped. Tightly in her lap, a handkerchief crumpled between them. Outside, the wind sighed through the chimneys, and the room seemed to listen. Grief had made her quiet, but winter made her still. From time to time, she looked toward the window, as though expecting to see his figure in the snow, the outline of a man crossing the courtyard or pausing beneath the lamplight by the chapel. But only the frost moved. Only the snow fell. The silence of the season felt deliberate, like a message from another world. By midnight, Windsor was sealed entirely in white, every gate locked by ice, every path lost to snow. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faint, uneven, half drowned by wind, and their echo trembled through the sleeping castle. Within those frozen halls, even the Queen's breath seemed to linger longer than life. The frost had arrived, and with it came a stillness no fire could melt. The castle woke without warmth. Its great corridors, long as rivers and twice as cold, held their breath beneath a skin of frost. Each sound lingered longer than it should: the clink of a tray, the cough of a servant, the far-off strike of a bell, all swallowed by the stone and returned, softer, thinner, as if the air itself were forgetting how to speak. Even the chandeliers above seemed to tremble with the chill, their crystals filmed with ice that glittered like tears. When the first maid crossed the grand stair, her footsteps rang out clear, echoing up through the vaulted ceiling until they came back to her from above. A perfect imitation. She stopped, listening. The sound stopped too. For a moment, she thought there was someone behind her, but when she turned, only the empty corridor stared back, portraits watching from their gilded frames, their painted eyes catching the faintest glint of dawn through frost-blurred glass. She curtsied to them out of habit, as though they might answer, then hurried on, her breath rising like prayer smoke. The air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and coal dust. Somewhere below, the kitchens were awake, the clatter of pans dulled by distance. But here, in the upper halls, the cold ruled everything. Curtains stood stiff as boards. The tapestries, ancient scenes of hunts and coronations, shimmered with rime, their threads stiffened into icy veins. Dust had frozen mid-air on window panes, catching the light like suspended ash. Windsor had become less a palace and more a mausoleum, a beautiful one, perhaps, but still a place where breath dared not linger too loudly. By mid-morning, the Queen's household began its slow routine. Servants lit what fires they could, couriers shuffled through galleries with letters bound in blue ribbon, the wax seals hard as stone. A chamberlain, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, carried an armful of unopened telegrams to the east corridor, where they'd wait for Her Majesty's hand. He moved carefully, his polished boots squeaking faintly on marble. For every sound he made, the hall returned a delayed echo, stretched thin, ghost-like. To those who worked in Windsor that winter, the sound of their own footsteps became company. The castle had a way of talking back. Whispers would travel down staircases that no one climbed. Laughter would drift faintly from rooms locked since the prince consort's death. Some said it was the acoustics of the old stone. Others said it was memory, trapped in the walls like breath on glass. When Victoria rose from her chambers that day, the echoes seemed to follow her too. Every rustle of her black morning gown multiplied into a sighing chorus that trailed her through the passageways. She did not look up, nor speak, but her presence bent the silence around her. As she passed beneath the arched door of the long gallery, frost began to melt where the light fell on her veil. The Queen paused at a window overlooking the courtyard. The panes were opaque with ice, but through the whiteness, faint shapes moved, men clearing snow, the distant flutter of ravens returning to the roof. She touched the glass with her gloved hand, and it groaned faintly beneath the pressure. For a moment, she imagined the sound was a voice, old and familiar, answering back from beyond the frost. Then the clock in the corridor struck 9. Its echo rolled through Windsor like thunder muffled by velvet, counting the hours of another frozen day. In that long, unending cold, even time itself seemed to move slower, pacing behind her like a shadow too tired to keep up. The morning light entered Windsor as a dull grey shimmer, struggling to reach past the frost-clouded windows. It fell across the Queen's private chamber, a room of velvet and silence. The fire in the grate had burned low, leaving only a dull orange core like the last heart beating in a dying body. Around it, the air hung heavy with the scent of lavender oil and old smoke, a scent she had chosen herself years ago when he was still alive. Victoria sat alone at her escritoire, her posture straight despite the weight that pressed invisibly upon her. Her widow's cap framed her pale face, her mourning gown pooling around her feet in folds of shadow. On the desk before her lay a collection of small things that never left her sight. A miniature portrait of Albert in uniform, the ivory comb he once used, a lock of hair sealed in glass, and a note folded so many times that its edges had worn soft as linen. She touched each one with slow reverence, as though they might crumble if handled too quickly. Outside, the frost thickened along the glass until even the sky disappeared. The world had narrowed to the faint hiss of the fire, and the scratch of her pen as she wrote. She did not write to anyone living. The letters were always addressed the same way, to my beloved Albert, followed by the date and the hour. She recorded everything: the failing health of the horses, the illness of her youngest child, the sound of the wind through the chapel tower at night. Her words were her confessions, her prayers, her proof that she still existed. When she finished each letter, she sealed it in black wax and placed it in a drawer already full of others. She did not weep anymore. The years had taught her that grief could turn to habit as easily as breath. Yet in the silence between the pages, her heart stuttered the same small tremor that came every Christmas, when the halls filled with songs she no longer permitted. Once, she would have joined the carolers. Now, she dismissed them. Music had become too dangerous. It awakened things she preferred to keep asleep. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Her lady-in-waiting entered, curtsying deeply, a silver tray in hand. Steam rose faintly from the teacup, already cooling in the cold air. "Your Majesty," the woman whispered, "the morning papers have arrived. There is word from Scotland the snow has closed the roads." Victoria gave no reply. Her eyes had drifted to the mirror across the room. For a moment, she did not recognize the figure staring back. The glass had fogged, softening her features, and behind her reflection loomed the faint suggestion of another, a man's outline, tall and indistinct, as if formed from the breath of the room itself. She blinked, and it was gone. She turned back to the window. Beyond the frost, the grounds lay buried under drifts of white. The world looked peaceful, but it was a kind of peace born from absence, a stillness that demanded surrender. Somewhere deep in the castle, a clock began to chime, slow and mournful. She pressed her gloved hand to her chest, whispering to the air, not in prayer but in memory. "Another Christmas, my dear," she murmured. "Another winter without you." The fire sighed, collapsing into ash. The frost crept further up the window, sealing the light out entirely. Inside Windsor's frozen heart, the Queen remained motionless, a figure carved from sorrow and snow, holding vigil for a love that time itself refused to thaw. The mornings were quieter now, too quiet even for a palace that had learned to live with silence. The frost muffled everything: the rattle of carriage wheels, the clink of breakfast trays, even the soft closing of doors. But one sound still carried through the corridors each day at the same hour: the rustle of paper, the faint scrape of sealing wax, the slow slide of a pen across the page. The Queen had taken to her writing early, long before the servants dared to enter. The table by the window stood ready, ink warmed by a small lamp, the heavy Balmoral stationery laid in perfect alignment, and beside it a stack of unopened envelopes tied in silk ribbon. Each bore the royal crest, and each came from Scotland. Balmoral, her beloved refuge, was buried in snow now, unreachable for months. Yet the letters kept arriving, their edges frayed from long journeys by horse and rail, their contents written in the careful hand of those who remained there, the caretakers, the groundsmen, the few who still tended to her northern estate. She read their words as though they were dispatches from another world. They wrote of icicles that hung from the gables like glass knives, of the River Dee locked in silence, of red deer wandering down from the hills in search of food. One wrote of hearing the wind move through the empty halls at night, like a whisper calling a name that could not be answered. The Queen traced her fingers over the parchment, feeling the grain of the paper. Balmoral was where she had been happiest, where Albert's laughter still seemed to echo from the stairwell, where the air had once carried the smell of pine and smoke instead of this damp London cold. She could picture him there even now, standing on the hillside in his riding coat, the sky wide and silver behind him. It was the one image she never dared to paint, for fear it might lose its warmth once trapped on canvas. "Would you go back, ma'am?" one of her ladies had once asked her quietly, months after his death. "If you could." Victoria had not answered then. She still did not. The question was too cruel in its simplicity. The living could travel, but the dead could not follow. She dipped her pen into the ink and began to write her reply. The words came slowly, the letters curling like vines. "My dearest Balmoral, my home, my comfort, my wound." She wrote of the frost at Windsor, of the hollow ring of the chapel bells, of the way grief had become a second weather, always present, always changing. She told them to keep the fires lit in the Queen's room, as if the warmth might reach her through the miles of frozen earth between them. When she finished, she sealed the envelope with black wax and pressed her signet ring into the cooling pool. For a moment, she hesitated, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. Then she laid the letter beside the others, waiting to be sent north, messages meant not for servants or stewards, but for ghosts. Outside her window, the snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. The flakes drifted against the glass, gathering like unspoken words. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the hills of Balmoral slept beneath the same white hush, and though the Queen did not say it aloud, every letter she wrote carried the same unchanging message, the quiet confession that she no longer belonged to the living, but to the frost, to memory, and to him. At dawn, the courtyard lay beneath a silence so complete it seemed sacred. The night snow had fallen heavy, burying the cobblestones in a white so thick it erased every footprint from the day before. Frost clung to the iron gates, glittering faintly in the first blue light, and the flag above the round tower hung stiff as parchment, its colours faded to ghostly shades. Windsor, so vast and powerful in summer, now looked half-dreamed, a monument of stone and sleep adrift in an ocean of ice. The servants were the first to disturb it. Wrapped in wool and silence, they emerged from the archways one by one, shovels in hand, their breath spilling like smoke as they cleared narrow paths between the doors. The horses in the stables snorted softly, stamping against the frozen ground. Their manes crackled with frost, and the steam of their bodies rose like mist around the lanterns. The youngest stable boy, barely 14, cupped his hands over a candle stub to coax the flame alive. He had never known a winter like this, a cold that burned, that froze the nails to the wood and made the air taste of iron. The Queen's carriage stood empty, its black lacquer dulled beneath a glaze of ice. No one had dared move it for days. The great wheels, once meant for parades and ceremonies, were half swallowed by snow. Beside them, a footman swung his hammer gently against a frozen hinge, the sound ringing through the stillness like a church bell. For every strike, the frost seemed to answer back, a sharp crack echoing from somewhere unseen, deep within the castle's walls. In the kitchens, the fires roared, but the heat never reached this far. The cold lived here, in the open court, where the wind funneled between the towers and cut through wool and skin alike. It crept beneath doors, seeped through cracks in the stone, and turned the breath of men into clouds that vanished before they could pray. Even the statues along the parapets seemed to shiver, their marble shoulders draped in frost, their faces glistening like mourners caught mid-sigh. From the Queen's window above, a faint curtain stirred. She was awake. Those who saw her said she stood motionless, framed by the dim glow of her chamber, watching as the servants fought the snow. Some whispered that she prayed for them, others that she did not pray at all. Her gaze, they said, was not fixed upon the living but upon something far beyond the walls, perhaps the chapel where her husband slept beneath the stone, or perhaps the white horizon itself, where the earth seemed to fade into heaven. By mid-morning, the light had turned thin and sharp. The wind rose, carrying fine crystals that stung the eyes like salt. The men retreated, their shovels abandoned beside the archway, their boots leaving only a few dark scars on the endless white. Above them, the ravens had gone quiet. Not a sound remained but the low moan of wind through the gates. When night came, it returned everything the servants had taken. The paths filled in again, the footprints vanished, the courtyard remade in perfect stillness. By candlelight, it gleamed like a lake of glass, and if one looked long enough, they might have seen just for a moment the faint reflection of a man walking beside her window, his shadow falling across the snow, leaving no trace behind. The frost did not spare the hands that served the queen. It bit first at the fingers, turning them pale, then blue, then white as the linens they washed each morning. Down in the servants' wing, where the heat of the great kitchen fires could never quite reach, the air stung like needles. The water in the basins froze overnight. They had to strike it with wooden spoons to break the crust before washing could begin. The sound echoed faintly through the narrow hallways, the rhythm of survival in a house where grandeur meant nothing against the cold. Mary Cheston, the laundress, wrapped her wrists in cloth before wringing out the sheets. Her skin had split in fine, red lines that smarted when touched by soap. She did not complain. To work in Windsor was an honor, even when it hurt. "Cold's no sin," she said, rubbing her hands by the brazier that glowed more smoke than flame. "It just reminds you you're alive." The younger girls laughed softly, though not from humor. Laughter was a way to keep the ache from settling too deep. The frost crept into their bones no matter how many layers they wore. In the scullery, steam rose from pots and met the cold ceiling in white clouds that dripped down again as ice. The maids worked in a half-frozen fog, sleeves rolled, breath visible. When the bell above the pantry rang, they startled the queen had sent for tea, or perhaps just a letter to be carried. Every task felt heavier this winter. Even the silver trays seemed colder to the touch, as if the metal itself resisted service. Upstairs, the higher servants fared little better. The footmen who tended the fireplaces returned each hour with coal dust in their hair and frost clinging to their cuffs. Some rooms could not be kept warm at all. The drafts were too clever, finding their way through keyholes and behind curtains. Fires hissed and coughed, choking on damp logs. "The walls breathe," one of them muttered, as he shut another useless grate. "They breathe, and they take the heat right back." In the still moments between errands, the servants gathered in the passage by the kitchen door. There, a single candle flickered on a cracked saucer, guarded by the cook like a holy relic. "For the queen," she said, each time someone passed too close. "We keep it lit for her. No one should wake to darkness." They nodded, though some whispered that the queen no longer feared the dark, that she'd grown used to it, the way the dead are used to silence. By nightfall, the wind moaned along the outer walls. The maids crossed themselves before sleep, their breath forming halos in the dark. One dreamed of Balmoral's green hills, another of her mother's kitchen in Sussex, warm and loud and ordinary. But when morning came, they woke to the same sound, the crack of ice, the sigh of the walls, and the distant ring of a bell calling them back to work. They rose in unison, their joints stiff, their hearts steady. For all the world's finery above them, it was the servants who kept Windsor alive that winter, feeding its fires, scrubbing its marble veins, breathing warmth into its frozen bones. Yet even they whispered that something else had begun to walk the corridors at night, something colder than the frost and quieter than prayer. By mid-December, the carriages began to arrive one by one through the mist. Their wheels cracked over the frozen gravel, the sound swallowed by snow. Horses moved like shadows against the white morning, their breath pluming in grey clouds. The castle gates opened slowly to receive them, the hinges stiff from ice. The guards wrapped in wool so thick their faces seemed carved from stone. Within the courtyard, the air shimmered with the faint scent of coal smoke and pine. It was meant to feel festive, but even Christmas could not outshine grief. The Queen's children had returned. They came from distant estates and foreign courts, their coats heavy with frost and travel. They arrived with their own households in tow, small armies of attendants, governesses, and wet nurses bundled in shawls. The sight might once have filled Windsor with laughter, with voices echoing down corridors, the slap of boots on stone, the smell of spice and wine from the kitchens. But this year, the sound was restrained, careful. Even the youngest among them knew the rule of the season. Joy was not to be spoken too loudly in the presence of mourning. Princess Alice's absence weighed most. Her death years earlier had left a silence that no arrival could fill. Victoria still felt her ghost in every echo of laughter, every child's step down the corridor. Now, as her other children entered the great hall, their breath misting in the cold air, she saw them not as adults but as fragments of her younger self, fleeting shadows of a happier time when Albert still stood at her side. They greeted her formally, a curtsy, a bow, a kiss upon her gloved hand. Even the eldest hesitated before embracing her. They spoke in tones meant for court, not for home. "You have travelled safely," she said softly, her voice thin as parchment. "The roads were cruel," replied the Duke of Connaught, removing his hat. "But we are here now, Mamma." Dinner that night was served in the smaller dining chamber, the long table half the length it had once been. The windows were veiled in frost, the candle flames wavering as draughts crept through the room. Silver trays gleamed untouched. The scent of roast goose heavy in the stillness. Conversation faltered between courses. The Queen asked after grandchildren she had never met, spoke of letters received, of servants fallen ill from the cold. The others nodded politely, answering as though to a monarch, not a mother. Outside, snow whispered against the glass. It had fallen without pause since dawn, burying the roads and gardens alike. The younger princes watched the storm instead of eating, tracing shapes in the condensation with their fingertips. One of them, Leopold, pale and frail, as porcelain began to cough, and the sound startled everyone. The Queen's hand tightened around her napkin, her eyes flickering toward him, the smallest tremor of memory crossing her face. For an instant, she saw Albert again coughing behind his hand, the fever just beginning to take him. When the meal ended, she rose without a word. The family stood as she passed, her black gown whispering across the floor. Behind her, the fire cracked, but its warmth did not follow her into the corridor. Servants bowed as she went by, her veil trailing like smoke. Upstairs, in the long gallery where portraits of kings hung rimmed with frost, she paused before Albert's likeness. The painted eyes met hers with the same calm that had once steadied her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she whispered the words she could not speak at the table. "They are home, my dear, but it is not the same." Outside, the snow thickened, blurring even the lamplight. Windsor slept beneath its weight, the laughter of children fading into dreams. The Queen's footsteps alone moving through the endless, frozen halls. The ballroom had once been the heart of Windsor's joy. There, beneath chandeliers that spilled light like melted gold, the Queen had danced with her prince hand in hand, the orchestra rising in full, glittering tide around them. The air had shimmered with perfume and laughter, lace and velvet brushing past candle flames that never seemed to burn out. Those nights had belonged to music and to love. But now, the ballroom stood in darkness. The doors remained closed most days, their brass handles dimmed from neglect. When the maids passed by, they did so quietly, as if the very air on the other side were sacred or cursed. Within, frost traced pale veins across the mirrors, climbing in delicate webs that blurred the faces of angels carved in plaster. The chandeliers, unlit, hung heavy with dust and ice, thousands of crystal drops frozen into silence. Each one caught the faintest gleam from the corridor lamps, but no warmth ever entered the room. It was said that the Queen never crossed that threshold anymore. Yet on that evening, after her family had retired and the castle had fallen into its usual hush, she asked for the key. Her lady hesitated. No one had opened those doors since the last Christmas Albert was alive, but the Queen's voice was calm, distant. "I will walk there," she said simply. The hinges moaned as the doors swung open, the sound echoing down the empty corridor like a sigh too long withheld. A wave of cold air swept out, dimming the candles in the hall. Inside, the smell of age and stone pressed close, mingled with something faintly sweet, the ghost of music long vanished. The floorboards gleamed faintly in the starlight that seeped through the high windows, every polished inch now veiled by a thin film of frost. Victoria stepped inside slowly, one hand brushing the fabric of her gown, the other gripping her cane. Her footsteps made no sound. She crossed the room's vast emptiness as though walking through memory itself. Here, he had stood. There, the band had played. The echoes seemed to stir in the walls, faint and rhythmic, a waltz half remembered. She stopped in the center of the room. The chandeliers loomed above, glinting faintly, like constellations trapped in ice. The Queen looked upward, her face pale in the dim light. "Albert," she whispered. The name slipped from her like a secret escaping into air too cold to carry it far. The wind pressed against the windows, rattling the panes. A single crystal dropped from the chandelier above, landing softly at her feet. The sound was sharp as glass breaking. She bent, slowly, and picked it up, the fragile tear of light trembling in her gloved hand. For a moment she held it close to her chest, then set it upon the mantel where once his portrait had hung. No one saw her leave the ballroom that night. The doors closed behind her without sound, and the key was returned to its velvet pouch. The frost inside the room thickened again before dawn, sealing the mirrors, dimming the marble, preserving every trace of her visit like a secret pressed between pages. And when the first servant entered the corridor the next morning, he paused at the door and listened. He thought he heard faint music, a waltz drifting low and distant, though no one had played there in 20 years. He crossed himself, whispered a prayer, and went on. The Queen, by then, was already awake in her chamber, writing another letter by candlelight. But her ink that morning froze before she reached the final word. The first bells began before sunrise, hollow and uneven, their tones slipping through the mist like lost voices. They came from St. George's Chapel, where the frost lay so thick upon the roof that it glittered even in darkness. The wind that swept across the courtyard carried their echo through the windows of the castle, waking the servants before it reached the Queen. In Windsor, dawn was not a matter of light anymore, but of sound, and on that morning, the sound was weary. By the time Victoria descended from her rooms, the air within the chapel hung heavy with incense. Pale smoke curled between the pews, rising like breath from the dead, the scent of myrrh and tallow clinging to every stone. The candles along the altar trembled, wax ran in slow tears down their stems. Outside, snow pressed against the stained glass, dimming the saints to silhouettes. Every color, crimson, gold, blue, had been dulled to a single shade of cold. The Queen entered without fanfare. Her mourning veil brushed the flagstones, already damp with melted frost. The chaplain, bent with age, inclined his head and began the prayers in a low, echoing voice. His Latin rolled gently through the nave, soft as the coo of doves trapped in rafters. Behind him, the organ stood silent, its pipes sealed by ice, its music held captive until spring. Victoria knelt at her accustomed pew, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her. She did not close her eyes. The winter light creeping through the glass fell across her face, and for a moment it seemed she might vanish beneath it, her skin as pale as the marble angels that watched over the choir stalls. Her lips moved soundlessly. The words were not for the living. Around her, the few attendants shivered in silence. Their breath drifted visibly in the air, merging with the incense smoke until it was impossible to tell which belonged to prayer and which to mere survival. The cold crept upward from the floor, numbing knees and fingers alike. Yet none dared shift or cough. They had learned that the Queen valued stillness above all things, that noise was an intrusion, a reminder of life in a place consecrated to memory. When the chaplain spoke the name of the prince consort, his voice faltered. The Queen's head lifted slightly. The pause stretched, fragile and endless, until he found the strength to continue. Somewhere near the back, a servant wept softly, whether from cold or sorrow, none could say. The sound echoed strangely, filling the vaulted ceiling with a resonance that seemed too large for one person's grief. After the service, the Queen lingered. The others withdrew quietly, their shoes scraping faintly on stone, leaving her alone beneath the high arched ceiling. She stared at the altar where the chalice gleamed in the dying light. Then, slowly, she rose. Her steps carried her to the far corner of the chapel, to the royal mausoleum door, its black iron glistening with moisture. She stood there, for a long time, one gloved hand resting on the latch, her breath misting the air. Beyond that door lay the vault, his vault where she had not gone for years. The cold radiating from the stone felt almost alive, almost welcoming, but she did not open it. Instead, she whispered a single word, too soft for even the angels to hear, and turned away. As she left, the dawn finally broke. Pale light spilled through the stained glass, setting the snow outside aflame in soft hues of pink and gold. The bells rang again, but this time their chime was faint, as though muffled by distance. The Queen's figure moved through the haze, small and black against the brilliance, the last shadow, leaving a house built for the living but haunted by the dead. The ink had frozen again. It clotted at the tip of the pen, a small black bead that refused to fall, and when it finally did, it bled too heavily across the page, a dark bloom spreading like rot through linen. The Queen sighed, her hand steady despite the tremor in her wrist. She had learned to write in layers, press lightly when the ink was thick, more firmly when it thinned with the heat of the candle beside her. Every word she set down was part ritual, part confession, a conversation that time refused to end. The chamber was quiet, but not still. The wind moved through the chimneys above like a restless spirit, moaning low and ceaselessly. It found its way beneath the door and along the floor, coiling about her ankles as she wrote. The smell of wax and old paper filled the room. On the desk lay an open letter addressed, as always, to Albert. She never wrote, "My late husband," never, "His Majesty," only, "My dearest one," as though he were still somewhere within reach. She began the day's entry with a simple line, "It has snowed again, and still the frost clings to the windows like grief." Her handwriting was small and precise, a pattern carved by memory rather than intention. She wrote of the chapel bells that sounded hollow in the wind, of the carriages buried in snow, of the children who spoke softly at dinner as though afraid their laughter might wake the dead. Each sentence carried the rhythm of prayer. Halfway through, she paused. The quill hovered above the page, her gaze unfocused. In the silence, she could almost hear him, the faint rustle of papers, the scratch of his pen beside hers, the two of them writing together, as they had once done at Balmoral. She could see his reflection in the frost-darkened window, bent over his work, his hair catching the light of a winter lamp. The illusion was so clear that for a moment she smiled, small and involuntary, the first trace of warmth on her face in months. Then the smile faded. The quill touched down again, but the next words came slower. "You are still here, my dear, though the house has forgotten your footsteps." The candle guttered, throwing a shadow across the page. The ink pooled once more, and she blotted it gently with the corner of her sleeve. The mark it left resembled a smudged fingerprint, his. Perhaps, if one believed in such things. When she finished, she folded the paper neatly, the motion practiced and tender. She pressed her signet ring into the wax seal, though no messenger would ever carry it. The letters were for him alone, not the world. She placed it in the drawer with the others, hundreds of them, bound in ribbon blackened with age, each one a piece of her heart embalmed in ink. For a long while she sat unmoving, listening to the wind claw at the windows. The fire in the hearth had died down to ash. In the faint glow that remained, the desk gleamed with frost where her breath had touched it. She reached for the next blank sheet, then stopped. "Not tonight," she whispered. The words vanished into the air, joining the countless others that had never been heard. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as ash from a distant fire. And when the candle finally went out, the room seemed to exhale the Queen's papers, whispering faintly, as if answering back. That winter, London ceased to move. The city's great artery, the River Thames, froze from bank to bank, a mirror of dull silver that swallowed the skyline whole. From Windsor's high windows, the Queen could see it in the distance, a motionless ribbon winding through the white fields toward the capital. The smoke of the city hung low above it, unable to rise, trapped beneath the same lid of cold that sealed the nation still. In the early mornings, before the fog rolled in, the ice caught the faintest blush of dawn, glowing like pewter under a breath of rose light. It looked peaceful from afar, almost beautiful, but those who went down to it knew better. The cold there had a will of its own. It sang in the iron railings and split wooden oars to splinters. The fishermen who once lived by the water's edge now gathered in silence by their shuttered huts, staring at the river as though at a coffin that refused to open. By mid-month, the ice was thick enough to bear weight. Word reached Windsor that people had begun to walk upon it first. The daring boys with sleds, then merchants pushing carts of roasted chestnuts and ribbons, then entire families. Soon it became a fair, as it had in centuries past. Tents rose like bright flowers against the endless white, their canvases trembling in the wind. Candles burned behind thin cloth walls, their light soft and yellow against the blue of the ice. There were jugglers and fiddlers, dogs in ribbons, couples skating hand in hand while the city itself slept beneath them. It was called the Frost Fair, though some whispered it was a kind of defiance, laughter flung in the face of death. When the news reached the Queen, she listened without expression. Her ladies described the wonder of it, how even the beggars found warmth in the crowd, how the river no longer seemed cruel but kind. Victoria nodded faintly, but her eyes drifted to the window, where frost veined the glass in patterns like veins under pale skin. "They dance above a grave," she said quietly. "That ice holds more than joy." In the days that followed, she asked each morning whether the thaw had begun. It had not. The frost deepened, and the reports grew stranger. Men claimed to hear the river groan beneath their feet, a deep, living sound that echoed like the breath of something trapped below. Others said faces appeared in the ice, blurred and fleeting, as if the river remembered those it had taken before. Late one afternoon, as the bells of Windsor tolled faintly through the snow, the Queen stood at her window and watched the horizon where London lay hidden under haze. She imagined the fair, the laughter, the music, the crack of skates on frozen water, and for a moment she envied them. To walk upon the Thames, to feel something solid where there should be none, to pretend, if only for an hour, that the world could still hold miracles. But when night fell, she ordered the windows covered. The frost had crept too far, threading over the panes until the candlelight flickered blue. In the dark reflection, she saw not the river nor its revelers, but herself, a pale face framed in black, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Behind her, the wind carried a sound, almost like distant cheering, though she knew it was only the ice breaking somewhere far downstream. By morning, the Frost Fair would continue, laughter and firelight dancing above a river entombed. And in Windsor, the Queen would wake to the same still cold, the same hollow silence, wondering which would give way first, the thaw or her heart. The firewood piles in Windsor's courtyard had begun to shrink. What once seemed endless, a mountain of dark fuel stacked against the walls like a fortress, now stood half its size, a black island amid the snow. Servants moved through the drifts with barrows and baskets, their boots leaving deep trenches in the whiteness. Each log was rationed, each spark carefully measured. The frost had entered every inch of the castle, and even the richest rooms now smelled faintly of damp ash and desperation. The Queen's household had grown used to cold over the years. They called it the Windsor chill, an old ghost that returned each winter no matter how many fires they lit. But this year, the ghost had teeth. Coal had grown scarce across the kingdom, the mines in the north slowed by blizzard and flood. The trains from Yorkshire came late, their cargo frozen solid, their wheels locked in ice. Letters from London spoke of shortages in every quarter, poor families burning, furniture to stay alive, shops shuttered at noon for want of heat. And though Windsor's stores were guarded and accounted for, there was no denying the truth whispered among the staff. The Queen's fires, too, were dying. Down in the lower corridors, the stokers worked by lamplight, stripped to their shirts despite the cold. Sweat froze to their collars as they hauled bucket after bucket into the grates. The air was thick with soot and frost alike, and every breath came with a cough. When they rested, they warmed their hands near the pipes, which rattled faintly but gave no heat. One man older, with a scar over his brow, muttered that the coal itself was cursed, that the earth had turned against those who dug too deep. The others laughed softly, though none disagreed. In the Queen's apartments, the fires burned low. The ladies in waiting placed furs across her lap and shoulders, but the chill crept through them as if drawn to her. The doctors had warned her long ago about the cold, that it deepened grief, that it weakened the heart, but she would not leave Windsor. "It is not the walls that chill me," she once said, but the absence of him who warmed them. And so she remained, day after day, beside the fading hearth. That evening, a footman brought word from the steward. The next shipment would not arrive for at least a fortnight. The Queen's hand paused mid-letter. "Then we will make do," she said simply, sealing the page and returning to her work. But her maid, young and new to the household, could not help but glance at the grate where the flames were little more than embers. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "shall I fetch more coal from the lower store?" Victoria shook her head. "Not yet. Others will need it more than I." The maid curtsied, her breath visible in the air, and withdrew. The Queen listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor until the silence returned, the kind of silence that hums with the sound of frost creeping. She leaned forward, resting her gloved hand near the fire's last light, and for a brief moment she thought she saw movement there, not flame, but the flicker of a shadow familiar in shape. The coal hissed once more, a final sigh before darkness. The Queen closed her eyes, her face lit only by the candle on her desk. The cold deepened around her, filling the room like water in a sinking ship. And still she did not call for more fuel. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the servants' fires, the last warmth left in a kingdom learning to endure the long, hard freeze. The first to see him was a scullery maid named Ellen, a quiet girl from Kent whose eyes had not yet learned to ignore the strange. It was well past midnight when she left the laundry with her arms full of linen, the corridor lit only by a few dying sconces. The air was brittle, sharp enough to crack a whisper in two. Her breath came out in white threads as she moved quickly through the passage that led toward the east wing, a place most avoided after dark. She said later that she heard nothing at first, only the faint creak of the castle settling under its own cold. Then, as she passed the portrait of the late Prince Consort, the one with the silver frame and the candle always burning before it, she noticed something strange. The flame did not flicker, it leaned forward, straight as a drawn breath, toward the darkened hall beyond. And then she saw him, a tall figure, standing near the far archway, motionless. The light from the single candle fell just enough to catch the 1916 outline of a man's coat, black, formal, the kind worn decades before. His head was slightly bowed, as if in thought. For one moment, she thought he was merely a guard, or a guest, wandering where he should not. But there was something unnatural in the stillness, a quiet, so deep it pressed against her ribs. The corridor, already cold, seemed to empty itself of air. She dared to whisper, "Sir?" The sound vanished without echo. The figure did not move, but she saw the faint shimmer of breath, a white curl that rose and dissolved into nothing. When she blinked, he was gone. The space he had filled remained colder than the rest of the hall. By morning, she told no one but the laundress. Yet gossip travels faster than warmth in a cold castle. Within hours, the story reached the upper servants, and by nightfall, the name had been spoken aloud. Albert, the Queen's beloved. the man whose portrait still hung above her writing desk, whose ring she still wore around her neck on a chain finer than spider silk. The staff whispered that he had returned not in haunting, but in habit, that he was drawn to Windsor by the weight of her sorrow, by the sound of her midnight prayers. One of the guards swore he saw the Queen herself walking the same corridor 2 nights later, candle in hand, her face half hidden beneath her mourning veil. He claimed she stopped by the same archway and whispered softly, though no one could hear what she said. The guard turned away, ashamed of having seen something not meant for mortal eyes. In the days that followed, the East Wing became a place of avoidance. The servants crossed themselves before entering, footsteps quick, voices hushed. The air there was always colder, as though the frost itself respected a boundary. The candle before the prince's portrait never burned out, though no one ever trimmed its wick. The Queen spoke of it only once. To her lady-in-waiting she said quietly, "He visits where love still lingers. Do not fear him. The dead are colder than the living, but not less kind." That night, snow began again slow, deliberate flakes that fell against the windows like unspoken words. And somewhere in the East Wing, unseen by all, a shadow moved down the corridor, its passing marked only by the faint scent of burning wax and the sudden stillness of air, too cold to breathe. Morning crept reluctantly into the castle, grey and thin. The frost had gathered overnight upon the windows of the gallery where the portraits hung, a long, echoing corridor lined with centuries of eyes. The lamps had been extinguished to save oil, leaving only the faint light of day to reveal the pale ghosts of kings and queens that stared down from their gilded frames. The room smelled faintly of varnish and cold linen. Dust rose with each step, drifting like ash through the chilled air. Victoria had not entered this room in years. Once, she had called it her Hall of Pride, the living memory of her lineage, a place where she could feel her ancestors breathing through the brushstrokes. But now, it was a place of burden. The faces were too knowing, the silence too heavy. Yet this morning, she came without escort, her black skirts whispering across the wooden floor, her gloved hand brushing the edge of a chair as if to steady herself. Her lady-in-waiting had tried to dissuade, to her, "The air is poor there, ma'am. It chills even the lamps." But the Queen had replied, "I will see them." And so she walked alone into the dim, frozen hall where time had been painted and framed, and where even light hesitated to remain. The portraits loomed above her, Henry with his imperious gaze, Elizabeth with her unreadable smile, George with his stiffened dignity. But she looked at none of them. Her eyes searched only for one. At the end of the gallery hung Albert. The artist had painted him as he was in youth, proud, steady, the faintest trace of gentleness in the corners of his mouth. The Queen approached slowly, her steps echoing through the silence. The varnish had cracked in places over the years, the golden tones fading into sepia. Frost had gathered along the lower edge of the frame, climbing like ivy. Yet his gaze had not dulled. Even through age and cold, he seemed to see her. She stood before him for a long while. Her breath fogged the air between them. "They say you walk these halls," she whispered. "Do you?" The question lingered, unanswered. The candle she carried sputtered, its flame trembling like a heartbeat. Her mind drifted backward to the day the portrait had been unveiled. Albert had laughed, embarrassed by his own image. "Too noble," he had said. "I am a man, not marble." Now the marble was all that remained, and she, the ghost. She reached out and touched the edge of the frame. The gilded wood was colder than iron. For a moment, she thought she felt a vibration beneath her fingertips, faint and rhythmic, as if the painting itself were breathing. Then it stilled. Behind her, the long line of monarchs seemed to watch. Their painted eyes followed her like a slow tide. She imagined their judgment, a queen who had turned her back on her crown to serve her grief. But she did not look away from Albert. "You ruled me better than any throne," she murmured, "and I am faithful still." The candle's flame flared once, bright and sudden, before shrinking to a shiver. Wax spilled over her glove, hot then cold. She set the candle down and stepped back. The frost along the frame began to melt, thin streams running like tears down the canvas. Whether it was the heat or something else, she could not say. When she finally left the gallery, she closed the door behind her, her shadow retreating into the corridor. The light dimmed, and for a moment, brief as a sigh, the eyes in the portrait seemed to glisten, alive once more in the silence of the room. News reached Windsor first by carriage, then by rumour, then by breathless gossip whispered among the maids. The Thames had frozen so thick in London that it had become a street of its own, a city built upon ice. They called it the Frost Fair, though some said it felt more like a dream or a rebellion. For weeks, the poor and the privileged alike had taken to the river, pitching tents and lighting fires where water once flowed. The Queen listened in silence as her attendants described it, their eyes alight with wonder. She imagined the laughter, the warmth of so many bodies together against the cold, the defiance of joy in a world half starved of it. Yet she could not bring herself to smile. The newspapers spoke of it in detail. Stalls line the frozen banks, one report read. Beer is served in pewter mugs, ribbons flutter from every post, and fiddlers play until the stars come out. She traced the words with her gloved finger, pausing on the line. Couples skate by. Candlelight. That was the sentence that undid her. For a moment, she saw Albert, his gloved hand steady around hers, the two of them moving across the ice at Balmoral, their laughter echoing in the open air. She had fallen then, once, and he had caught her with that boyish smile she never forgot. The paper trembled in her hands before she folded it neatly away. By evening, she could not resist, asking for the carriage to be prepared. Her attendants exchanged glances, uncertain. The roads were treacherous, the snow relentless, but the Queen's command was quiet and absolute. "Not to London," she said, "only as far as the river's bend. I wish to see it." They travelled slowly through the white dusk. The horses' breath steamed like fog. The wheels groaned in the drifts. The countryside stretched out around them, silent villages, hedgerows buried under snow, the world washed clean of colour. When at last they reached the river, it gleamed under the moonlight like glass, wide and still. From afar they could see faint lights, the flicker of lanterns where the Frost Fair burned against the horizon, too distant for sound to carry, yet alive enough to feel. Victoria stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into the crusted snow. Her breath hung in front of her, thin and white. She stood by the bank for a long while, gazing toward that faraway glow. The fair looked like something from a different life, one she might have lived, once, before her world had frozen. She could almost hear the laughter if she closed her eyes, almost feel the warmth of his hand again. "Would your Majesty care to go closer?" her lady ventured softly. "No," the Queen said, her voice steady, distant. Some joy should remain unspoiled by sight. When they returned to Windsor, the frost was thicker than before. The great towers shimmered under the moon, each one crowned with ice. The Queen retired without another word. But that night, her dreams were bright, with music fiddles on frozen water, firelight dancing on the river's glassy skin. And when she woke near dawn, the wind carried faint laughter against her window, the sound of a city daring, for one fleeting night, to live upon death's frozen mirror. Dinner was served at 7:30, though few hungered for it. The long table gleamed beneath the candlelight, a procession of silver and crystal stretching toward the far end of the chamber where the Queen sat alone in her high-backed chair. Her presence seemed to dim the room rather than illuminate it. The fire hissed weakly in the hearth, its smoke clinging to the air, while frost clung stubbornly to the corners of the windows, glowing faintly in the candlelight like trapped stars. The servants moved like clockwork, graceful, soundless, each step rehearsed. Their breath misted faintly in the air, and though they bowed deeply, their faces showed strain. It was too cold even here, in what should have been the warmest room in the castle. The soup cooled before it reached the table. Steam rose from the dishes for only a heartbeat before vanishing into the chill. Victoria sat upright, her black gown a shadow against the white linen. A diamond brooch glimmered faintly at her throat, the only sign of colour. To her right, her son, the Prince of Wales, spoke sparingly, murmuring pleasantries about the frost fair and the condition of the railways. She nodded, her eyes distant, as if his words reached her from another century. Across from him sat her daughter Helena, who fidgeted with her napkin, her hands reddened by cold. The others watched their mother in silence, measuring every sigh, every pause. Conversation at Windsor had become an act of survival, not of wit, but of care. The Queen's moods were winter weather in themselves, unpredictable, sharp, and absolute. Tonight she was quiet, though not calm. Her eyes lingered on the empty chair at the table's far end, the one that had remained unoccupied for more than 2 decades. The servants still set it, at her order. A glass, a plate, a folded napkin, all placed precisely where he had once sat. The first course was removed, untouched. The second fared no better. Cutlery clinked faintly, a brittle sound that vanished too quickly. The Queen lifted her fork once, then set it down. The Prince cleared his throat. "The Prime Minister writes that London believes the thaw will come soon," he said carefully. "The worst may soon pass." Victoria looked up slowly, her eyes dark and unreadable. "The worst never passes, my son," she said. "It only changes its name." No one spoke after that. The candles burned lower. The clock ticked, its pendulum sounding louder in the silence. Somewhere beyond the door, the wind moaned through the chimneys, rattling the lids of serving dishes, as though the castle itself shivered. When the final course was brought, spiced pudding with raisins and cream, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Remove it," she said softly. "The air is too cold for sweetness." As the servants cleared the table, she rose. Her chair scraped softly across the stone floor. She paused beside the empty place at the end of the table and rested her gloved fingers upon the back of the chair. "Good night," she whispered, not to the living, but to the memory that still sat across from her. The family bowed their heads as she left the room, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. Only when the great doors closed did anyone breathe again. The candles flickered once, their flames bending toward the empty chair, as if drawn to what lingered there. Then the room went still once more, a kingdom of silver and silence, ruled by absence and cold. It happened just after dawn, the kind of hour when frost still clings to every surface and breath turns to steam before the first word is spoken. The courtyard was a sheet of white glass, the cobblestones buried beneath a glaze so perfect it reflected the towers like mirrors. The footman had been ordered to clear a path from the carriage house to the chapel, where the Queen planned to attend the morning's prayer. But no amount of salt or sand could tame the ice that day. It had frozen too deep, as though the earth itself had chosen to harden. Thomas Avery was the youngest of them, barely 20, newly promoted from stable hand to royal footman. He was proud of the post, proud enough to rise before the others, to take the first shovel and start before the dawn bell. The wind stung his cheeks raw as he worked, his breath sharp in the air. He hummed softly to himself, to keep rhythm a habit from childhood, and the sound echoed strangely against the stone. The frost glistened with deceptive beauty, each shard catching the faint blush of morning. When Thomas stepped back to admire his progress, he didn't see the patch that gleamed brighter than the rest. His boot slipped, the shovel clattered, and in the next moment he was down, his leg twisting beneath him, the sound of bone cracking sharp and final. He cried out once, his voice cutting through the quiet courtyard like a struck bell. Then came the silence, heavy and endless. It was an older servant, Henry Black, who found him moments later. He called for help, and the others came running, their lanterns scattering light across the snow. They lifted the boy carefully, his face white as the ice itself, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The castle physician was sent for, and by the time the Queen's lady-in-waiting was informed, the young man had been carried inside, laid out before the fire in one of the unused ante-rooms. Victoria heard of it by mid-morning. The report was brief. A footman, injured on the grounds, a leg broken, condition grave. Such incidents rarely reached her directly, but this one did, perhaps because of the severity, or perhaps because the castle had grown so still that any sound of suffering carried through it like music. She sent word that blankets be given, and a tray of broth and wine. No one expected more. Yet later that evening, as the storm thickened and the castle retreated into silence once more, the Queen herself appeared at the door of the anteroom. Her presence startled the attendants into silence. She stood for a moment by the threshold, her black shawl drawn close, the candlelight catching the faint gleam of her mourning jewels. The boy struggled to rise, but she gestured for him to remain still. "Do not move, child," she said softly. Her voice, though quiet, carried an authority that silenced the room. She looked down at him, at the pale face, the trembling hands clutching the blanket, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, reaching into her sleeve, she withdrew a small embroidered handkerchief and placed it gently upon his chest. "For the pain," she said, though the gesture could not ease it, "you will recover." When she left, the firelight dimmed behind her, and the boy swore he felt warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with flame. In the days that followed, he would tell the story again and again, how the Queen had come herself, how her eyes, though cold as winter, had carried the weight of every sorrow in the world, and though the storm raged outside for 3 more days, no one slipped again. It was said the ice in the courtyard cracked that night, as if bowing before the hand that ruled even grief. By the time Dr. George Jenner's carriage reached Windsor, the light was already fading into a milky haze. The snow along the approach had hardened into glassy ridges that made the horses stumble, and the driver swore softly under his breath as the castle's towers loomed out of the fog. To the doctor, Windsor always felt less like a palace than a living monument, its walls too heavy with memory, its air perfumed with cold and formality. He had been here many times before, summoned for matters of the Queen's health, but each winter visit felt different. This time, it was not sickness that awaited him, but silence. The chamberlain met him at the gate, his breath misting in the air. "She has not been sleeping," he whispered, as they walked the long corridor. "The fires cannot keep the cold from her rooms. She eats little. She writes much." His tone carried both worry and resignation. One could never speak too directly of the Queen's grief. Dr. Jenner said nothing. He had known her for 20 years, through storms and fevers, through the sharp decline of those around her. He had seen what mourning could do to the body, how it stiffened the blood, dulled the eyes, and slowed the very pulse of life. In the Queen, it had become her second nature. He was led to her private study, where the scent of coal and candle wax hung thick in the air. The curtains were drawn, though the pale light of late afternoon filtered through their edges, casting faint patterns on the floor. The Queen sat by the writing desk, her hands folded over a sheet of parchment she had not yet begun. The fire behind her burned low, throwing long shadows against the wall. "Dr. Jenner," she said without looking up. Her voice was even, though it carried the weariness of sleepless years. "You are come to observe my decline, I suppose." He smiled gently, bowing his head. "I am come, ma'am, to preserve your strength." She gestured for him to sit. The chair beside her crackled, faintly with cold. "They fret too much," she murmured. "It is winter. I feel what all things feel when life hides beneath the frost." He studied her closely, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the bluish cast to her lips. Her pulse, when he finally took her wrist, was slow but steady. Not illness, he thought, endurance. The body clinging to its routines long after the spirit has withdrawn. He suggested warmth, thicker blankets, longer hours of rest, a tonic of cinnamon and iron, and laughter, if your majesty can bear it, he added softly. The faintest trace of amusement crossed her mouth. "Laughter," she repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "I recall its sound." When he rose to leave, she surprised him by standing as well. "Tell me, doctor," she asked, "is it possible to live too long in sorrow?" He hesitated. "It is possible, ma'am," he said at last. but it is also possible to endure it too nobly for death to interfere. Her gaze softened not in gratitude, but in recognition. "Then I shall continue," she said simply. As he departed through the hall, he paused by one of the great windows. Outside, the snow had ceased, and a faint glow hung over the distant fields. He thought of her alone in that dim room, a monarch surrounded by ghosts, her heart still beating like a clock wound too tightly to stop. When he reached his carriage, he turned once more toward the castle. Smoke curled faintly from the Queen's chimney, a thin, wavering thread of life against the frozen sky. And though he had prescribed fire and medicine, he knew what truly kept her alive was neither. It was duty, sharpened by grief into something colder, stronger, and endless. The garden had once been the Queen's solace, a sanctuary of roses and fountains, where laughter had drifted through summer air like music from another world. Now, it lay buried beneath the snow. Every hedge was a pale mound, every tree a skeleton etched against the white sky. The paths had vanished entirely, swallowed by frost. Even the birds had deserted the place. Only the statues remained, their marble faces furred with ice, their expressions softened by the silence of winter. It was late afternoon when Victoria decided to walk there again. Her ladies protested at first the air was too cruel, the ground treacherous, but she silenced them with a glance. "I will see my garden," she said. He loved it best in winter. A servant wrapped her in a heavy cloak lined with sable, and another followed at a distance, carrying a lantern that glowed weakly against the dimming light. The Queen stepped out through the east door and into the garden's white expanse. The air bit her cheeks, yet she did not flinch. The cold, she thought, was the only honest thing left in England. It neither lied nor pitied. Her boots sank into the snow with soft, deliberate sounds. The wind combed gently through the bare branches, shaking loose a glittering fall of ice that drifted around her like crystal dust. She walked without direction, her gloved hand brushing the tops of frozen shrubs, the scent of earth long buried beneath the frost. When she reached the rose beds, she stopped. The trellises stood black and brittle, their vines encased in a thin sheath of glassy ice. She bent slightly, her veil brushing the nearest branch, and saw within the ice a single dead blossom, its petals brown but preserved, as if caught mid-breath. Albert had planted these roses himself, the first year of their marriage. He had insisted they were a symbol of endurance, of beauty surviving the storm. She remembered how he used to walk beside her here at dusk, his hand gloved in hers, speaking softly about the future, a future that had long since frozen. "Do you see what has become of your garden?" she whispered into the stillness. "Even your roses cannot wake." The wind stirred in answer, low and mournful. Somewhere behind her, the servant shifted uneasily, the lantern light quivering across the snow. She turned toward the sound, but her eyes caught something else instead, a faint impression near the fountain. Footprints, fresh ones, 2 sets, one small and neat, the other larger, deeper, and already half filled with snow. For an instant, her breath caught. She took a slow step closer, then another. The prints led nowhere, vanishing at the fountain's edge. It was only the snow, she told herself. The servant's work, and yet, as she looked down at them, she could not shake the sense that the air there was warmer, as if someone had just passed through. "Come, Your Majesty," her maid called softly from behind. "It grows dark." Victoria turned one last time to the fountain. The stone figures within it were rhymed with frost nymphs and cherubs caught mid-dance, their faces veiled in ice. She reached out and touched one, her glove coming away wet. The surface was thawing, just slightly, under the faint pressure of her hand. As she walked back toward the palace, she thought she heard a footstep behind her, faint but steady, keeping pace. She did not turn. The sound faded as she reached the doors, leaving only the hush of falling snow. Inside, her ladies rushed to take her cloak, but she paused in the doorway, glancing back through the frost-glazed glass. The lantern's glow still flickered among the trees. The footprints were gone, Yet she could not shake the feeling that the garden, like her grief, had never been empty, only waiting, quietly, for her return. The storm came without warning. One moment the afternoon lay quiet, the pale sun faintly visible through a grey veil, and the next, the world had vanished behind a wall of snow. The wind swept down from the north in long, unbroken sighs, carrying flakes so dense they blurred the towers of Windsor into ghosts. From the courtyard to the highest parapet, everything disappeared under the same unrelenting white. The castle seemed to shrink into itself, its great stone body shuddering beneath the weight. By dusk, the blizzard had become absolute. The guards at the gatehouse could barely see one another through the drifting powder. The lanterns burned blue, their flames pressed flat by the wind. Servants barricaded doors with woolen cloth to stop the draughts that howled through the keyholes. Coal was heaped into the grates, though the fires sputtered, coughing against the storm's breath. Every corridor hummed with the same thin sound, a vibration, almost musical, as though the entire castle had become a single frozen instrument. In the Queen's apartments, the temperature fell so low that frost bloomed upon the walls. Her writing desk gleamed with a thin, glittering crust, and even the ink in her bottle stiffened into sludge. She sat wrapped in a black shawl before the fire, her hands folded tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The storm thundered against the windows like surf against a cliff. Once or twice, the panes shuddered violently, as if struck by invisible hands. Her ladies begged her to move to the warmer chambers on the lower floor. She refused. "If the crown must freeze," she said, "then so shall I." They looked at her, frightened, uncertain whether she spoke in metaphor or defiance. From the battlements, one could see almost nothing, just a vast, swirling blindness. The flag atop the round tower had stiffened into a shape like sculpture, each fold encased in ice. The wind howled through the crenellations, a long, continuous moan that sounded half-human. Somewhere below, the chapel bell began to ring on its own, struck not by rope, but by the gale. Each toll echoed across the valley, slow and uneven, as though the storm itself had found a voice. That night, the Queen did not sleep. She sat by the window and watched the flakes whip past, their movement hypnotic. She thought of the years that had passed since Albert's death, each one like this storm, burying her a little deeper, layer upon layer of quiet suffocation. Duty had been her shelter, but grief had become her weather, permanent and unending. At midnight, the wind reached its peak. The room shook. The curtains billowed inward, though the windows were sealed. The Queen rose and went to the glass. Beyond it, the snow had piled high against the ledge, obscuring everything but a faint silver shimmer, the moon breaking through the clouds for one fragile instant. In that light, the towers seemed to glow from within, their crowns of frost, glinting like crystal. She pressed her palm to the window. The cold stung her skin, sharp enough to draw tears. She imagined the crown of England somewhere above her, resting invisible in the dark, heavy, frozen, enduring. "Even the heavens are burdened tonight," she whispered. When dawn finally came, the storm was gone. The world outside lay still, transformed into a landscape of white marble. Icicles hung from every arch like daggers. The Union Jack, frozen solid, caught the first rays of sunlight and glittered like a jewel, a crown of ice upon the kingdom, shining cold and perfect against the morning sky. When the storm finally broke, it left the world eerily calm, as if sound itself had been buried beneath the snow. The castle's chimneys stood smoking faintly against a sky so pale it seemed carved from bone. Servants moved carefully through the corridors, speaking in whispers, unwilling to disturb the fragile quiet that followed the blizzard. Even the Queen, who had spent the long night without sleep, felt the strange peace that comes after destruction. The storm had passed, yet something of it lingered, a heaviness in the air, a kind of hush that felt almost sacred. That morning, one of her attendants brought her a small parcel found among the stores of the nursery. It had been discovered while the maids cleared out a chest of toys for polishing a wooden box. Simple, unassuming, its surface scratched by age. The Queen looked at it without expression at first, then with faint curiosity. "Set it there," she said, pointing to the table beside her. The maid obeyed, then withdrew, leaving Victoria alone with it. The box was carved from rosewood, its inlay of mother-of-pearl dulled by time. A faint inscription curled along the rim in Albert's handwriting. "Für die Kinder," for the children. She touched the letters with the tip of her gloved finger, tracing the grooves where his penknife had once cut the wood. Her throat tightened. She remembered the day he had given it to their eldest daughter, years before, a Christmas morning filled with laughter and the faint scent of orange peel and pine. The music box had played then, bright and delicate, its tune echoing through the nursery while Albert stood smiling in the doorway. She lifted the lid now, half expecting the melody to burst forth again. At first, there was only silence. The mechanism had seized, its key stiff with rust. She hesitated, then turned it gently. The metal creaked. A few faltering notes stuttered into life, thin, uncertain, trembling like a voice long unused. Then, slowly, the Farley's tune found itself, a lullaby from her German childhood, one Albert had sung softly to the children when the nights were long. The Queen closed her eyes. The music seemed impossibly small in the vastness of the room, a fragile sound fighting to survive in the air's cold weight. Each note shimmered, hesitated, and fell, like snowflakes melting as they touched the ground. The melody filled her chest until it hurt. She saw again the nursery as it had been, the firelight flickering on tiny faces, Albert's shadow bending over a cradle, his hands steady and sure. When the final note faded, it left behind a silence deeper than before. The Queen did not move for a long time. Her hand rested on the open lid, her breath shallow, her eyes reflecting the dim firelight. Then she said softly, "He remembered everything." A servant entered quietly to tend the fire and stopped, startled. The music box was still turning, though no sound came from it, the wheel spinning silently, as if the melody had gone elsewhere. The Queen noticed too, but she did not stop it. "Let it turn," she murmured. "There are things that must keep moving, even when their song is done." When she finally rose to leave, the faint scent of rosewood lingered in the air, and the box kept its silent rhythm long after she had gone. Some swore later that they heard it play again that night, not from the table, but faintly through the corridor walls, its tune carried by the cold, winding through the halls of Windsor like a memory refusing to sleep. The night returned quickly in those December days. Twilight seemed to fall before the servants had even finished lighting the lamps, and by the time supper was cleared, Windsor had vanished into darkness once more, a vast shape wrapped in frost and silence. Only the faint gleam of candlelight marked where life still lingered inside its walls. The Queen's window, high above the courtyard, was one of those rare lights. Its glow burned long past midnight, a small golden pulse against the winter sky. Victoria's ladies had begged her to rest. The physician had left strict instructions. She must not sit up so late, must not keep her chambers uncurtained through the coldest hours. But she ignored them all. The curtains remained drawn back, the windows bare, the frost thick upon the glass. It pleased her to see the snow outside, the reflection of moonlight on the courtyard below, the way it made the world seem clean, emptied of noise. Yet lately, she had begun to feel that she was not the only one watching. It began with movement faint, peripheral, the kind that vanished when one looked directly, a flicker near the edge of the glass, like the brush of a coat in passing. The first time it happened, she thought it was the wind, or a trick of the flame. But the second time, she saw the shape more clearly. A man's outline, tall and straight, framed against the drifting snow. He stood motionless for several seconds, his features obscured by the frost, and then without footstep or sound he was gone. The Queen did not cry out. She merely lowered her head, the faintest smile passing her lips. The mind, she told herself, was a cruel servant. Yet that night she wrote no letters. Instead, she sat by the window until dawn, her hand resting upon the glass, her breath clouding the frost. By morning, she dismissed the incident as imagination, though her maids whispered otherwise. One claimed to have seen a light moving through the courtyard after midnight, a single lantern swaying as if carried by an unseen hand. Another said the frost on the window pane had taken the shape of a man's face, delicate as engraving. None dared speak of it within earshot of the Queen, for superstition had no place in royal corridors. Still, they crossed themselves each night before entering her chamber, whispering that the Queen's sorrow had summoned something back from the veil. That evening, as the snow began again, she returned to the window. Outside, the world glowed silver beneath the moon. The ice along the ledge shimmered faintly, like the edge of a mirror. She stood for a long time without moving, her reflection wavering beside her two silhouettes, the living and the lost. "Albert," she whispered, and the name drifted into the glass like breath. The candle beside her guttered. A sudden gust pressed against the window, hard enough to rattle the frame. The frost shifted. For a moment, she thought she saw a handprint form in the white. Fingers splayed, the mark clear and human before it faded into nothing. Her maid found her hours later, still standing there, her eyes fixed upon the empty pane. When asked what she had seen, the Queen only said, "He watches kindly." After that night, the servants began to notice something strange. Each evening, when the last candle was extinguished and the castle surrendered to darkness, a single window remained lit above the courtyard, its glow unwavering until dawn, as though two souls still kept vigil together on opposite sides of the glass. January dawned without warmth, a pale sun rising over a kingdom still locked in white. The frost had entered everything by then, the wood, the stone, the water in the pipes, even the people themselves. It was in their movements, their silence, their breath that smoked and vanished before it reached another's ear. And in the Queen most of all, it had taken root not in her skin but somewhere deeper, where blood once quickened at laughter, at music, at love. Her ministers came and went through the days as though walking through a tomb. They bowed low, their words measured, their cheeks raw from the cold. They spoke of Parliament, of policy, of railways halted by ice and ships trapped in the Thames. The Queen listened from her chair by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes half closed. When she did speak, her voice was calm and colourless, like wind moving across snow. "The nation endures," she said to one adviser who fretted about the shortage of coal. "It always does. England was built to suffer with dignity." He nodded, but when he left the room, he crossed himself as quietly as he could. The staff had begun to whisper that her blood had turned cold. She ate little, drank only tea gone lukewarm, and spent hours at her writing desk without once approaching the hearth. The ladies in waiting wrapped her in furs until she looked carved from them, but she seemed not to notice. "Do you not feel the chill, ma'am?" one dared to ask. "I am long past feeling," Victoria replied. The truth was that she did feel it acutely, endlessly, but not in her body. The cold that dwelled within her was not of the air, it was of memory. It came each morning when she reached for her pen and found the chair beside her still empty. It came when she opened her mouth to speak and realized she had no one left to confide in. It came when she dreamed of Balmoral's summer light and woke to frost tracing the edges of her window. One evening, as the storm winds rose again, she summoned her physician. "Tell me," she said as he took her pulse, "can grief change the body?" Dr. Jenner hesitated. "In time it alters all things, ma'am. The heart most of all." She turned her gaze toward the fire. "Then mine has already transformed. It burns, but without heat." Outside, the snow thickened until the world disappeared. The castle walls groaned under the wind, and the lamps in the corridor flickered. The Queen did not move. The physician bowed, dismissed. She remained by the hearth, staring into the coals that glowed like distant suns, her face a study in stillness. Later that night, her maid found her asleep in the chair, her hands clasped loosely around a half-written letter. The ink had frozen mid-sentence. the pen still resting against the page, and though the fire still burned, its warmth could not reach her. In the morning, the servants noticed something peculiar. The frost that covered the window above her desk had melted inward, tracing a pattern that resembled veins spreading, delicate, branching like a living thing. It glistened faintly in the grey light. Some said it looked like the roots of a tree, others said it looked like the lines of a human heart, caught forever between thaw and ice. The snow had begun to crust at the edges, hardened by weeks of wind and cold. The roads outside Windsor lay buried but navigable, narrow veins of grey cutting through the white landscape. It was along one of these paths that a small black carriage set out toward Eton, its wheels groaning, its lamps glowing faintly in the fog. Inside sat the Queen, wrapped in sable and silence, her gloved hands folded neatly over a small parcel in her lap. It had been weeks since she had left the castle grounds. The household watched in astonishment as word spread of her intention. She would visit Eton College to deliver gifts to the boys for Christmas past. A gesture of charity, she said, though everyone knew it was more than that. Albert had loved the school, visited it often with pride. He had walked those same paths on winter mornings just like this, his coat collar turned up, his laughter white in the cold air. The journey was slow. The driver could see no more than a few yards ahead. The tribally-like time, horses' hooves struck sparks against hidden stones. From time to time, the Queen's maid peered out the window, her face pale in the dim glow. The world outside looked endless, a shifting expanse of white and shadow. The only sound was the rhythm of wheels and hooves, muffled by snow. Victoria sat motionless. Her reflection floated faintly in the frosted glass, her face blurred and ghostly. The parcel in her lap contained a silver inkwell, engraved with the royal crest, a gift for the headmaster. She had chosen it herself that morning, but now she wondered why. What could silver or seal mean in a world buried under ice? She imagined Albert's voice beside her, patient and warm, explaining that symbols were what sustained a nation and a widow. She closed her eyes and let the thought steady her. Halfway to Eton, the carriage stopped. The wind had risen sharply, whipping snow across the road until the world vanished. The driver shouted an apology from outside, his words nearly lost to the storm. The horses stamped and shivered. The Queen's maid reached for her hand, trembling. "Do not fear," Victoria said softly. "We are merely reminded that man serves nature, not commands it." When they resumed, the castle's towers were already swallowed by mist. For a moment, the Queen felt utterly removed from time, as though she travelled not through miles but through years, retracing the same road she and Albert had once taken together. In her mind, she could hear his laughter again, could see the plume of his breath in the cold, the flash of his boots against the snow. The memory was so vivid it seemed to ride beside her, silent but present. At Eton, the boys lined the walk, their faces pink from cold, their eyes wide at the sight of the carriage. The Queen stepped out with measured grace, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The headmaster bowed low as she handed him the inkwell. "For your scholars," she said, her voice formal, but her eyes far away. When she turned to leave, one of the smaller boys, bold with youth, called out, "God bless you, Your Majesty." She looked back at him and smiled faintly. "And may he keep you warm," she replied. The ride back to Windsor was quieter still. The wind had died, leaving only the hush of falling flakes. As the castle came into view, its windows aglow, she thought again of that young voice calling into the snow. It sounded, for just an instant, like Albert's, a blessing carried by the cold, meant to reach her no matter how far she had drifted from the world of the living. The great hall had been dressed for Christmas long before the storm, and though the season was long past, the decorations still hung there, faded and frozen in place. Garlands of evergreen, now brittle and colourless, draped the walls like funeral wreaths. The tables were set once again, not for celebration, but for ceremony, as they always were when tradition demanded appearances. The Queen had ordered a feast to be laid out, though she had invited no guests. It was the formality of it she required, the appearance of festivity, the gesture toward life. The servants obeyed in silence. They moved like ghosts through the hall, their footsteps muffled by the cold. Silver gleamed faintly beneath the candlelight. Steam rose briefly from the tureens of soup before fading into nothing. Pheasants, pies, sugared fruits, puddings, all laid in perfect symmetry along the long oak table. Yet the hall was so vast and so cold that even the aromas could not survive there. Within minutes, the feast seemed already abandoned, the food turning dull beneath its weight of ceremony. When Victoria entered, the few attendants waiting by the walls bowed low. She walked slowly to the head of the table, her black gown whispering against the stone floor. She did not remove her gloves. The fire at the far end struggled weakly, barely touching the darkness that filled the corners of the room. A single chair had been placed opposite hers, not out of protocol, but memory. She stood for a moment at the foot of the table, gazing at the full spread before her. "It is too much," she said softly. He would have said so. No one dared reply. She sat, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the polished arms of her chair. The footman poured her wine, the liquid gleaming like garnet in the glass. She lifted it, held it to the light, and then set it down again without drinking. The hall was silent, save for the ticking of the great clock above the hearth. The Queen's eyes roamed the table from dish to dish, from glass to glass. It was the same setting that had been arranged every Christmas since his death. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 napkins folded side by side. The first years she had ordered it so out of grief. Now, it was habit, the ritual of remembrance hardened into tradition. She reached across the table and touched the rim of the untouched plate opposite her. Her fingers lingered there, tracing the circle of silver as if drawing a boundary around loss itself. "You dined here last," she murmured, when the snow began to fall outside. "I remember you laughed at the fire's smoke. You said the chimney wept." Her voice trailed off. The flames snapped sharply in the grate, scattering a brief glow across the walls. She looked up then, her eyes following the light's reflection as it flickered through the empty chairs. For a moment, she could almost believe they were occupied a trick of shadow, perhaps, or memory reshaping air. The servants waited until she rose again, her expression unreadable. "Clear it all," she said. "The hour is too late for feasting." They bowed as she turned and left, her figure receding through the high doorway until it disappeared into darkness. As the attendants moved to obey, a single candle guttered out, leaving a tendril of smoke that rose toward the rafters. The smell of extinguished wax mingled with cold meat and coal dust. When they finished clearing the plates, they noticed something strange. Her glass of wine, though untouched, had emptied itself halfway, as if shared by someone unseen. By morning, frost had covered the entire table in a thin, glimmering sheet. The plates, the goblets, the silver utensils, all locked beneath a veil of ice, as if time itself had sat down beside the Queen to dine and found the world too cold to finish the meal. The chapel bells rang that morning with a brittle, metallic sound, not the rich, resonant tones of celebration, but the hollow peal of cold metal striking colder air. Their echo drifted over Windsor's frozen lawns and up to the castle windows, summoning what few souls remained brave enough to step into the chill. Inside Street, George's Chapel, the candles shivered in their holders, their flames bending as the winter wind pressed through cracks in the stone. The scent of incense mingled with the sharper smell of damp wool and thawing boots. The Queen entered last, her small figure draped in mourning black that trailed like smoke across the marble floor. The congregation, a modest gathering of courtiers, servants, and family, rose as she passed. The sound of their movement filled the space briefly, then died. The organ stood silent. Its pipes had frozen solid days before. There would be no music, only words. The bishop began the sermon with trembling hands, his voice quavering in the cold. He spoke of endurance, of faith through hardship, of the warmth promised beyond the grave. His words hung pale in the air, their breath visible, their conviction faint. "For even in the darkest frost," he said, The Lord's love burns beneath, unseen, but eternal. The Queen listened without expression. Her gloved fingers clasped a small prayer book bound in faded leather. Around her, the others bowed their heads, but her gaze remained fixed upon the altar. The candles there dripped steadily, their wax pooling like slow tears upon the cloth. She heard the bishop speak of joy, of hope renewed with the season, but the words struck her as cruel. What joy could there be in a world so white and still, where even memory had frozen? Her thoughts drifted instead to the pew where Albert had once sat beside her, his gloves folded neatly, his eyes lifted toward the same windows now rimmed with frost. She remembered his voice during hymns, low and sure, the only sound that could steady her heart during the weight of coronations, wars, births, and loss. Now only the draught whispered through the aisles, turning the pages of her prayer book as if by unseen hand. When the sermon reached its end, the bishop's voice faltered. "We are reminded, in this blessed season, that love endures beyond death," he said softly, his eyes darting toward her. "That though bodies turn to dust, the soul, the truest part of what we love, remains." At that, the Queen closed her prayer book. "The soul remains," she repeated under her breath, her voice barely audible. To those nearest it sounded like agreement. To her, it was disbelief spoken aloud. The final prayer was said. The congregation murmured their amens, their voices rising like faint smoke. When the Queen stood, the rustle of her gown filled the chapel, a sound more commanding than any hymn. She moved toward the altar, pausing before the golden cross that glimmered dimly in the cold light. Her gloved hand reached out and touched its base. The metal was icy, enough to sting her skin even through the fabric. Outside, snow began again, falling against the stained glass and muting the daylight to gray. The candles flickered once, twice, and one went out the tallest, the one nearest the altar. A faint hiss followed, as if the flame had been taken deliberately. The Queen turned then, her eyes reflecting the last trembling light of the sanctuary. As she walked slowly down the aisle, those gathered bowed their heads once more. None spoke. The bishop watched her go, uneasy in the silence she left behind. When she reached the great doors, she paused and looked back. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw a shadow seated in the pew where Albert had once been, head bowed, hands clasped, a figure as still as stone. But when she blinked, it was gone. The doors opened with a groan. Cold air swept through the chapel, extinguishing half the candles in a single breath. Behind her, darkness followed like a tide, and the echo of the bells began again, slow, deliberate, tolling through snow and stone alike, as though marking the hour not of worship, but of remembrance. The Queen's chambers glowed with the dull light of dying embers. Midnight had long passed, and most of Windsor slept or tried to. The wind had risen again, whispering through the chimneys and rattling the latches of windows that never quite sealed. Down in the servants' quarters, the air was filled with the slow crackle of logs, the faint clang of the poker against the grate, and the sound of muffled breathing as two ladies in waiting took their vigil. They had been assigned the night watch, a quiet duty, unspoken in name but understood by all. The Queen could not be left alone by the fire, not in the late hours, when dreams seemed to slip into waking life, and grief took shape in the room like a presence made of smoke. She would fall asleep sometimes in her chair, her letters open upon her lap, the ink still fresh, the candles burning low. Other nights, she would speak softly, as though to someone unseen. "You may rest, my dear," she would murmur. "I have not forgotten." On this night, the watchers spoke little. They sat at opposite ends of the hearth, their shadows long and wavering upon the wall. The fire hissed fitfully, the wood damp from the unending cold. Every so often, one would rise to stir it, pushing the coals together with slow precision, unwilling to break the fragile spell of silence. The Queen sat as she always did, upright, her face turned slightly toward the flames, her eyes unfocused. She had dismissed them earlier, but they had remained at the threshold, unwilling to obey. "She'll not notice," whispered one. "Let her think we guard the fire." Around 2 o'clock, she stirred, her head lifted slightly, her lips moving. The women leaned forward. "Did you hear it?" the Queen asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Hear what, Your Majesty?" "The music box." Her tone was calm, certain. "It's playing again." They listened. There was nothing but the wind. "No, ma'am," said the elder, softly. "It is quiet tonight." Victoria did not respond. She leaned forward, her hand extended toward the flames. Her expression softened the kind of softness that comes from seeing something too precious to name. "He's near when it plays," she said, after a long pause. "You mustn't be afraid." The younger attendant felt a shiver run through her. She wanted to say the fire's crackling was only the sound of damp wood splitting, that the mind can turn grief into music when silence grows too loud. But she said nothing. After a time, the Queen's eyes closed. Her breathing steadied, shallow but even. The attendants rose quietly and moved closer, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, careful not to wake her. The elder touched her wrist to feel the pulse slow but firm. She nodded to the younger, who added 2 more logs to the hearth. The room filled with the scent of smoke and resin, the faint hiss of pine. Outside, the wind subsided. A fragile calm settled over. Windsor, like a sigh, released. The 2 women sat again, their eyes fixed on the fire's low glow. And then, faintly, almost beneath hearing, came a sound delicate, rhythmic, like the turning of a tiny metal wheel. They froze. The elder rose, looking toward the writing desk in the far corner where the small rosewood music box sat. Its lid was closed, yet something within it moved the faintest vibration, the softest echo of a lullaby. Neither spoke. The fire dimmed again, its light pulsing in time with the melody no one dared name. When the Queen stirred once more in her sleep, a smile, small, fleeting, impossibly gentle, crossed her lips. At dawn, when the watchers were relieved, they found the ashes cold, though the wood had not burned through. The music box was still, its key unwound, but pressed into the thin layer of frost upon its lid was the faint outline of a man's hand larger than hers, and warmer, though the air was cold enough to bite. The children of the staff began it a small act of warmth in a place that had forgotten what warmth was. It started on the evening after Epiphany, when the sky dimmed early and the frost burned blue on every window. The castle was half asleep, its halls echoing with the slow, careful steps of those still working after supper. Down in the mews, near the edge of the gardens, the children gathered with glass jars, candle stubs, and small scoops of snow. They were the sons and daughters of stable hands, cooks, and laundresses, bundled in coats too thin and mittens patched a dozen times. Their laughter was faint, muffled by scarves, but it was the only laughter left in Windsor that winter. One of them, little Agnes, the groom's daughter, had seen a picture in an old book of Japanese lantern festivals, and she'd said in her small, confident voice, "We could make our own for the Queen." And so they did. They packed snow into hollow mounds, carving small alcoves into their endos, sides, and set a candle inside each. When lit, the flames shone through the white walls, turning the snow to a gentle amber glow. By nightfall, they had built a whole line of them along the path, leading toward the chapel, fragile lights in the endless dark. From the upper windows, the maids saw the flicker first. At a glance, it looked like willow, the wisps, tiny souls wandering the gardens. Then, realizing what it was, they smiled and pressed closer to the glass. "Look," one whispered, "they're making stars on the ground." The Queen heard of it only the next morning. A chamberlain, uncertain whether to mention it, brought the news while reporting on the condition of the frozen pipes. "There are well lights in the garden, ma'am, made of snow. The children call them lanterns." "Lanterns?" she repeated, pausing with her teacup midway to her lips. "Who ordered them?" "No one, Your Majesty." He hesitated, then added, "They say they're for you." That afternoon, she asked for her cloak. The ladies protested, but she insisted. The wind had softened. The sun, though faint, glimmered on the snow like powdered glass. When she stepped into the garden, her breath caught. The path was lined with dozens of glowing mounds, their lights still burning behind thin walls of melting snow. They flickered in the breeze, alive, trembling, beautiful. She walked slowly between them, her steps careful, the hem of her gown brushing the snow. The lanterns reflected in her eyes small, quivering fires that seemed almost to bow as she passed. For the first time in many weeks, her face softened. "They have made the night kind again," she murmured. By evening, she ordered that the children be given warm soup and sweet buns from the kitchen. "Let them know," she said, "that their queen saw their light." That night, as the last lanterns melted and went dark, the servants swore they saw new ones appear beyond the path, smaller, fainter, as though the glow had spread on its own, wandering deeper into the snow-covered gardens. And from her window, the queen stood watching. The faint flicker of light moved like a procession of souls through the dark, their soft radiance mirrored in her eyes. For the first time in years, she did not reach for her pen or her mourning veil. She simply whispered, "Thank you, my children," and turned away, leaving the curtains open so that, should any of the lights return, they might know she was still watching, and that somewhere within Windsor's frozen halls, warmth had found a way to live again. It was the mirror that betrayed her. In the still hours before dawn, when the fires had sunk to ash and even the wind seemed to rest, she rose from her writing desk to fetch more paper. Her candle cast a weak, trembling glow across the room, glinting against the tall looking-glass that stood beside the wardrobe. She had walked past it 1,000 times without seeing herself, the habit of years spent avoiding her own gaze. But that night, something drew her eyes to it. The glass had fogged from the cold, a thin veil of frost creeping up from the bottom. At first, she saw nothing but a blur of shadow and flame. Then, as she stepped closer, the frost began to melt where her breath touched it, and her face appeared, or rather, what remained of it. The woman in the mirror looked pale, sharp-edged, her eyes deep as bruises, her mouth drawn thin. Behind her, the faint reflection of the fire looked like a crown of embers on her bowed head. For a long while, she simply stared. The silence was so deep that the faint hiss of the candle's wick sounded like a voice. "Is that me?" she murmured. The words escaped before she could stop them, carried away into the chill. It seemed impossible that this was the same face once painted in oil and praised in courts across Europe. The lines at her eyes looked carved, her shoulders hunched beneath the weight of black silk. Time, grief, and frost had conspired together, and she was their masterpiece. Yet as she watched, something strange occurred. The reflection wavered. For a moment, she thought the glass had caught her candle's movement, a trick of the flame. But then, her mirrored self straightened, ever so slightly, and her eyes, those hollow, tired eyes, seemed to lift. The faintest color returned to the reflection's cheeks, the mouth softening into the ghost of a smile. She froze, her pulse quickening. "Albert?" she whispered. The mirror clouded again, as if something unseen had breathed against the glass from the other side. The figure blurred, then reformed, not entirely her, not entirely anyone else. For one fleeting heartbeat, she saw them both, herself as she was now, and beside her, or perhaps within her, the echo of the man she had lost. The two faces overlapped her black veils and his kind, steady eyes, until she could not tell where one ended and the other began. Her hand rose of its own accord, fingertips brushing the cold surface. The frost cracked beneath her touch, spreading fine white veins across the glass. The image wavered once more and dissolved, leaving only her reflection, small, lonely, trembling in the dark. When her maid entered an hour later, she found the queen seated before the mirror still, her candle burned to the stub, her hand resting in her lap. "Your Majesty?" the maid whispered. Victoria stirred faintly. "The mirror lies," she said softly. "It shows what has gone, not what remains. But when the maid turned to draw the curtains, she caught sight of something upon the glass, faint, almost invisible in the dim light. 2 handprints side by side, one smaller, one larger, pressed into the frost, and as the sun crept weakly over the horizon, the glass misted once more, as though something within it was breathing still. It lay in a small cabinet near her writing desk, a box no larger than a folded handkerchief, wrapped in silk so pale it had yellowed to the color of candle smoke. No one in the household spoke of it, though every servant who had dusted that shelf knew it by heart. They called it Her Majesty's December box, for it was always moved, polished, and replaced with reverence each winter, never opened, never touched for long. The Queen herself had placed it there. It had arrived the week after Albert's death, sent from a jeweler in Vienna, addressed in his handwriting. The parcel had been ordered months before. The fever struck him down, a Christmas gift, meant for her hands but never delivered in life. She had known its contents without needing to see them. He had mentioned, once, a brooch of jet and pearl, engraved with her initials, meant to match the one she had given him their first year as husband and wife. She could still hear his voice when he described it, the soft excitement of a man who found meaning in small, perfect things. For more than 20 winters it had remained sealed. She had promised herself she would not look, that to open it would be to admit that time had moved on. Each year she thought she might, and each year she could not. It was her last conversation with him, preserved in silence. On this morning, though, something shifted. Perhaps it was the sunlight, dim but golden, that crept through the frost-laced window and touched the cabinet's edge. Perhaps it was the echo of the children's snow lanterns still haunting her dreams, or perhaps it was simply weariness. Whatever the reason, she found herself standing before it, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she reached for the small parcel. The silk wrapping was stiff now, fragile as old parchment. The black ribbon had fused into the fabric, its knot tight as bone. She sat slowly, the box on her lap, the morning quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. For a long while, she simply stared at it, her heart pacing itself against the seconds. Then she untied the ribbon. The sound, that small, whispered release, filled the room like a sigh. Inside was what she expected, a brooch of jet carved in the shape of a lily, a single teardrop pearl set at its heart. It was beautiful, though simpler than her jewels usually were. The note beneath it, written in his careful hand, read only, "For my dearest, to wear when the frost returns. Yours, A." Her vision blurred. The letters seemed to swim upon the page. She lifted the brooch and turned it in the light, watching it glimmer faintly, a single gleam in a world gone grey. Then she pressed it to her chest, just above her heart, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir there, a warmth so brief and fragile it frightened her. When her lady entered an hour later, the box was empty, the silk neatly folded beside it. The brooch, now pinned to the Queen's morning gown, shone like a drop of night against her breast. "Your Majesty," the lady whispered, "it is beautiful." Victoria nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the frost forming along the window. "It was meant for a Christmas long ago," she said, "but perhaps love is patient. It arrives when it is ready, not when it is sent." Outside, the snow began to fall again, softer now, gentler, as though the sky itself had learned restraint. And on her lap, where the box had rested, a small patch of warmth lingered, refusing, for once, to fade. It was the 24th of December, when the carriages finally appeared through the veil of snow, 4 dark shapes moving slowly up the long approach to Windsor, their wheels muffled by the drifts. The choir from Street George's had been expected days earlier, but the storm had trapped them in Reading, their letters delayed, their supplies exhausted. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the servants' quarters, like the return of light after a long eclipse. There would be singing again in the chapel, voices, not wind, filling the vaults. The Queen heard of it over breakfast, her tea gone cold as the steward made his report. "They come tired but well, ma'am," he said, bowing. "The boys have travelled through the night." "Then let them rest before they sing," she said softly. "We have waited long enough for sound." By mid-afternoon, the castle stirred with an energy it had not known in months. Footmen carried blankets and food to the visiting choristers. Maids opened shutters that had been closed since autumn. The chapel, dusted and swept, began to breathe again. Candles were placed in every niche and window, hundreds of them, their light trembling against the stone like the pulse of returning life. The organ had been coaxed back to service, its pipes warmed carefully, the ice melted from its throat. When the Queen entered that evening, the air itself seemed to pause. The boys stood in two lines, their white surplices bright against the grey marble, their cheeks pink from cold. Their choirmaster bowed low, gesturing for silence before lifting his hand. Then, with a single breath, the first note rose clear, fragile, and impossibly young. It was a hymn she had not heard since Albert's time, one he had loved for its simplicity. Once, in royal David's city, the opening solo trembled, but the sound grew stronger as the choir joined in, the harmonies folding one upon another until the entire chapel seemed to shimmer. The Queen did not move. Her hands were clasped tightly, her eyes fixed upon the flickering candles along the altar. To those watching, she looked as she always did, composed, remote, carved from dignity. But inside her, something began to shift. The voices filled the high arches, rising into the darkness where the carved angels waited. For a moment, the chill receded, the air grew warmer, the candles brighter. It was as if the music itself were breaking through the frost that had gripped her soul for so long. She closed her eyes. The sound washed through her, a tide of childhood and loss, of faith she could no longer name but still, somehow, felt. She imagined Albert standing among them, his voice blending with theirs, unseen but undeniable. When the hymn ended, the boy's breath hung in the cold air like incense. The Queen opened her eyes and rose slowly. "Again," she said, once more. They sang it twice more that night, until even the youngest of them could no longer hold the notes steady. When they finished, the Queen stood for a long moment in silence before speaking. "Your voices," she said, "have reminded this house that it still belongs to the living." The choirmaster bowed, unable to speak. As the Queen left the chapel, the music lingered in the stone, a soft aftersound, a pulse that refused to die. Later, when the servants extinguished the candles, they found the wax had pooled in the shapes of tiny stars, as if the song had burned its own constellation into the marble. That night, the snow outside softened, the wind went still, and from her chamber window, the Queen looked down upon the chapel roof, where faint plumes of smoke rose into the clear air like the last verses of a prayer that, for once, had reached heaven. The cold crept back with the dawn. It slipped beneath the doors and along the seams of the windows, gathering quietly like fog. The morning sun rose thin and colourless, touching the castle only long enough to reveal its exhaustion. The snow piled high against the towers, the icicles like daggers hanging from the eaves, the drifts hardened to glass. Inside, even the air seemed fragile. Breath sounded like the rustle of paper. On her desk, the Queen's letters lay in uneven stacks, their edges curled and brittle with age. The ink within them, the letters she had written and never sent, had begun to fade, frozen mid-word in the chill. The wax on their seals had cracked, fine lines running through it like veins in marble. They were her secret empire, these letters. Every grief, every memory, every conversation with the dead pressed flat between pages. Each one addressed to Albert. Each one signed the same way, ever yours, V. This morning, she sat before them in silence. The fire burned low. The pen at her side was useless. The ink inside the bottle had hardened into a black crystal. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, then fell. For the first time in years, she did not write. She simply looked. One letter, its ribbon frayed, caught her eye. It was dated the winter of his death, the first she had written when the world was still breaking apart around her. She unfolded it carefully. The words blurred, but she knew them by heart. You are gone, and yet you fill the room. You are absent, and yet I cannot move without feeling your gaze upon me. She had read it 100 times, and each time it hurt the same. Outside, the post-carriage arrived late as usual, its wheels skidding on the ice. The sound broke her trance. She turned toward the window, watching as the postman fought against the wind, clutching his bag as if carrying treasure. Somewhere in that sack were letters addressed to her, petitions, reports, greetings from ministers, condolences still, coming decades too late. Letters from the living, meant for a woman who now answered mostly to ghosts. When her lady brought the new mail into the room, the Queen nodded faintly. "Set them down," she said, "beside the others." "Shall I sort them, ma'am?" "No," she replied, eyes still on the window. "Let them rest. Paper suffers in the cold." The maid hesitated, then withdrew. The Queen waited until she was alone again. Then, slowly, she rose, her joints stiff with age and frost. She walked to the window and pressed her fingertips against the glass. The outside world shimmered with a blinding whiteness. In the snow below, she could see faint figures, stable boys clearing paths, their movements blurred by the glare. She thought suddenly of the letters she used to receive from Albert, while he travelled the way she had once awaited his handwriting, as though it were sunlight itself. Now, she realized, she had spent half her life waiting for words that would never come again. Her gaze returned to the desk. The letter she had unfolded lay open, the ink shimmering faintly. Then, as if the frost itself had found a voice, a sound cracked through the room, a soft, brittle noise, like parchment tearing. One by one, the sealed letters began to fracture along their wax seams, their bindings breaking under the pressure of the cold. The Queen stepped closer. The air shimmered faintly above the desk, disturbed by nothing visible. The topmost letter curled open on its own, its page lifting as though by breath. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw handwriting she did not recognize, words written not by her, but to her, and then the flame in the hearth flared sharply, blinding her. When she looked again, the letters lay still. The broken seals gleamed faintly in the firelight. The air smelled of melted wax and snow. She gathered them gently into a single pile, her hands trembling. "You are answered," she whispered. And somewhere beyond the frest window, the first snowflake of the evening fell slow, deliberate, and perfect, landing on the frozen pane like a signature. That night, the Queen would not go to bed. The fires were kept lit in every room that touched hers. By her command, a strange extravagance in a season when coal was scarce. She had grown fearful of the dark lately, not because of what it hid, but because of what it revealed when the light returned. The shadows seemed to move differently now, almost thoughtfully, as if they remembered things she could not bear to. So the fires burned. The ladies-in-waiting took turns tending them. 2 at a time, they kept vigil through the night, feeding logs into the grates, stirring embers back to life whenever the flames began to shrink. The air smelled of smoke and wax, and the rooms trembled faintly with heat that never quite reached comfort. The Queen sat in her usual chair beside the hearth, the one upholstered in faded green velvet, her small frame swallowed by layers of shawls. On the low table beside her rested a candle, a silver clock, and the rosewood music box that had been silent since that strange night. "Your Majesty," whispered Lady Ponsonby, "the hour grows late. The physician insists. He insists upon many things," the Queen interrupted gently, "but he does not command time." The women exchanged uneasy glances. She had not slept more than an hour a night in weeks. Her eyes were bright, too bright, like glass held near fire. The servants whispered that she was fading, though her body refused to yield. They said grief had become her pulse, slow and relentless. The hours passed in soft increments, the settling of coal, the sigh of the wind through the flue, the whisper of fabric as the Queen turned a page in her journal. She wrote without pause, her handwriting steady, the pen scratching faintly against the paper. Once, Her hand trembled. "The fire," she murmured. "It remembers him." The youngest attendant, Clara, looked up from her sewing. "Remembers, ma'am?" Victoria smiled faintly, her eyes still on the flames. "Fire does not consume all. Some embers last beyond their hour. So too, I think, does love." The logs shifted suddenly, throwing up a brief plume of sparks. For an instant, the flames shaped themselves into something almost human, a suggestion of shoulders, of a bowed head. Both women saw it. Neither spoke. The fire snapped again, collapsing back into ordinary heat. When the Queen finally set down her pen, the candle had burned low, its wax pooling in uneven rivulets. She closed the journal carefully and leaned back in her chair, her eyes following the dance of the firelight. "You may rest," she said softly to the women. "I will call if I need tending." But they did not go. Instead, they withdrew to the adjoining room, leaving the door slightly ajar, watching her shadow from the crack in the wood. It moved once, reaching toward the fire, and then stilled. An hour later, the logs sank inward with a soft sigh, sending a faint glow across her face. She seemed peaceful then, her breathing shallow but calm. Clara rose quietly, crept forward, and adjusted the shawl over the Queen's knees. The air near the hearth was warm, almost tender. The music box, untouched on the table, began to hum again, a slow, uneven rotation, its mechanism winding of its own accord. The melody was faint, but the Queen's lips curved as though she recognized it. By dawn, the fire had burned to ash. When the attendants entered, they found her still seated. Her journal closed beneath her hand. The faintest trace of soot marked her fingertips, as though she had touched the fire one last time. And though the hearth was dark, a single coal deep within still glowed red, pulsing like a heartbeat, refusing to fade. By morning, the castle had gone quiet, not the gentle quiet of rest, but the hollow kind that follows exhaustion. The storm had broken at last. Its roar, which had filled every corridor for weeks, now dissolved into an eerie calm. The air hung heavy and grey, as though the sky itself had not yet realized its fury was over. The snow lay thick upon the roofs, gleaming under the pale dawn. Drifts reached the lower window-sills. Icicles hung from the towers like blades. Servants emerged slowly into the courtyard, blinking against the light. The world they stepped into was unrecognizable, still and colorless, like a cathedral sculpted from bone. The Thames, long hidden beneath ice, had begun to murmur again beneath its frozen skin. Somewhere deep in its belly, water was moving, unseen but alive. Within Windsor's walls, the aftermath began. Fires were rekindled, carpets shaken free of frost, shutters unlatched. The household, weary but relieved, moved through their tasks with a sense of cautious rebirth. Yet beneath the small sounds of revival, the clatter of pails, the creak of hinges, the sweep of brooms, another rhythm lingered, the slow, tentative breathing of a house waking from a long sleep. The Queen had not yet risen. Her attendants waited by her door, uncertain whether to disturb her. The night had been long. The hearth had burned bright until the first blush of dawn. At last, Lady Ponsonby knocked gently and entered. The air was cool but calm. Victoria sat by the window, already dressed, her veil pinned carefully, her eyes fixed upon the horizon. The snow outside reflected a dim blue light across her face, softening every line. "Your Majesty," the lady whispered. "The storm has passed." Victoria nodded. "Yes," she said quietly, but the silence remains. She had slept little. Instead, she had watched the storm break the black sky, unraveling into streaks of violet and grey, the thunder dwindling to the sigh of wind against the sky-black glass. It had felt like watching the end of something greater than weather, a long, invisible battle being surrendered. From her window, she could see the thaw beginning. Small rivulets trickled down the slope of the garden, dark veins cutting through the snow. Birds had begun to return, tentative and small. They flitted between the bare branches, their movements sharp and uncertain. She watched them with a strange fascination, as though the act of flight itself were proof that the world still possessed courage. Down below, in the servants' courtyard, someone began to shovel a narrow path through the snow. The scrape of metal on stone echoed faintly up to her window, rhythmic and sure. She found it oddly comforting, a sound of labour, of life reasserting itself against the cold. Lady Ponsonby approached with a shawl, but the Queen raised a hand. "No, leave it," she said. "I wish to feel the air." She opened the window a crack. The cold slipped in immediately, raw, bright, filling the room with the scent of wet stone and thawing earth. She closed her eyes and inhaled. The air felt sharp in her lungs, but it stirred something within her, a memory of youth, of rain-soaked gardens, of laughter before grief had turned her to marble. "Do you hear it?" she asked softly. "My Queen?" "The drip," she said, "the world melting." A silence followed, deep and fragile. Then from the distance, the faintest sound, the low groan of ice cracking upon the river. The thaw had begun in truth. Later that day, as the servants cleared the terraces, they found the remnants of the snow lanterns half melted, hollow, their wax candles still standing upright in pools of water. The Queen ordered that they be left as they were. "Do not destroy them," she said. "They have earned their rest." By nightfall, the last clouds had drifted east. The stars emerged above Windsor, faint at first. Then in clusters, their light reflected in the Yekhe, thawing ice below. The storm was over, and though winter would return, this moment, this stillness between ruin and renewal, felt sacred. And from her open window, the Queen whispered into the quiet, not as ruler, not as widow, but as a weary soul grateful simply to breathe again. "He has gone," she said, "but the world remains." The candle beside her flickered once, caught in the cold air, and steadied. For the first time in months, the flame did not waver. The morning after the storm broke was unlike any other in that long, unrelenting winter. The castle awoke to stillness, a true stillness, not the uneasy hush of grief, but the fragile quiet that follows deliverance. The air felt lighter, freer, almost tender. Frost still clung to the edges of the windows, but it glowed now, no longer a prison of ice, but a veil through which sunlight filtered softly, golden and forgiving. At first, the bells did not ring. The ropes were frozen stiff within the belfry, their fibers slick with ice. It took 2 men to loosen them, their gloved hands raw as they worked in the cold. Then, as the sun crept higher above Windsor's snow-blind towers, the first sound broke through a low, hesitant chime, dull but pure. It shivered through the morning air, echoing across the white landscape, a single note trembling between worlds. The Queen heard it from her chamber. She was standing by the window, her reflection faint against the frost, her breath fogging the glass. When the first bell rang, she did not move. But when the second followed, clearer and stronger, her hand rose slowly to her chest. The sound seemed to travel straight through the walls, through the stone and bone of the world, until it reached something within her that had not stirred in years. She remembered another morning long ago, when Albert still lived, when those same bells had rung for Christmas Mass. The castle had been filled with warmth then, the corridors alive with light and laughter, the air thick with the scent of fir and wine. She could still see him at the chapel door, turning to smile at her as the carolers sang. How different the sound had been then, not fragile, not mournful, but full and certain, a promise of life continuing forever. The present bells wavered again, then steadied. Their rhythm gathered strength, as though the air itself were learning to breathe anew. Beyond her window, the servants paused in their work. The cooks stopped, stirring their pots. The maids stood still on the stairs, their arms full of linens. The entire household seemed to freeze, not from cold, but reverence. Even the ravens, circling the courtyard, slowed their flight. The bell's resonance rolled outward over the white fields, reaching the distant villages, where chimney smoke rose in thin blue ribbons. Each toll carried a kind of softness, a reminder that even in a world carved by sorrow, Something still answered from above. The queen closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. For a moment, she forgot her titles, her crown, her endless mourning. She was only Victoria, a woman who had loved, lost, and endured. The notes seemed to call to that smaller self, the one who had walked beside a man through gardens filled with sunlight and laughter. She could almost feel his hand again, warm against her own, guiding her toward the chapel steps. When the bells fell silent, their echo lingered in the air like breath. She remained at the window, her fingers tracing the frost's edge. Below, the snow was melting in thin streams, trickling from the eaves and gutters. Drops of water caught the morning light, flashing like jewels before vanishing. Lady Ponsonby entered quietly with tea. "The bells sound well again, ma'am," she said softly. "Yes," Victoria replied, her gaze still distant. "They sound older, but alive. Perhaps that is how one survives, not by staying unchanged, but by ringing on despite the cold." The lady bowed her head and set the cup beside her. The queen did not drink. She stood listening to the faint creak of the thaw, the slow rhythm of dripping water, a new kind of music, the song of the world awakening from ice. Outside, the last bell struck once more, a long, steady note that hung in the air long after it should have faded. It sounded less like metal and more like breath, a sound not made by man, but by morning itself. And in that quiet that followed, the queen did something she had not done in many years. She whispered a prayer not for the dead, but for the living. The morning light returned weakly at first, a pale wash that bled through the thinning clouds. But as the hours passed, the sun grew stronger, not the fierce light of summer, but the quiet persistence of renewal. From her window, Victoria watched as the frost upon the lawns began to weep, thin streams of water tracing paths through the snow like veins beneath translucent skin. The great oaks stood dripping, their branches heavy with thaw, each drop glinting as it fell. The queen had not set foot beyond the castle since the storm began. Her world had been measured in corridors and rooms, in firelight and silence. But that morning, something within her, a pull she did not quite understand, urged her toward the open air. She rose without calling her attendants and rang only once for her cloak. The maids exchanged wary glances. They had grown used to her stillness. When they offered to accompany her, she shook her head. "No," she said, "I will walk alone. The world looks different when no one watches you see it." The air outside bit her cheeks, yet it was not cruel. The sky had cleared to a pale, almost translucent blue. Beneath her boots, the snow had hardened into a crisp crust that cracked softly with each step. She moved slowly across the terrace, one hand grazing the balustrade where icicles still hung like organ pipes. The sound of melting water filled the air, steady, rhythmic, like the ticking of an unseen clock. Down in the garden, the remnants of the children's snow lanterns still stood, their sides collapsing, their candles drowned. She paused beside one, crouching slightly, her gloved hand brushing the soft, wet edge. A faint warmth lingered within it, the memory of flame. "Everything leaves a trace," she murmured, "even light." From that spot, she could see the chapel roof, glistening under a film of melting ice. A group of servants were clearing the paths below, their laughter faint but genuine. She listened to it as one might listen to birdsong after a long silence. Their happiness did not wound her as it once had. It stirred something gentler, gratitude, perhaps, that life could bloom even in the shadow of death. She walked further into the garden, her breath fogging faintly in the air. The world smelled different now, the cold still sharp, but beneath it, the faint scent of damp earth, of something green hidden just beneath the surface. The wind carried the soft creak of thawing branches, the muted drip of melting snow. The world, she realized, was not dying, it was breathing again. At the far end of the garden, she stopped before the fountain. The ice that had sealed it for weeks was cracking, the sound low and musical. Beneath the surface, water shimmered like liquid glass. She leaned on her cane and stared down, her reflection rippling faintly in the thaw. The face that looked back at her was still pale, still marked by sorrow, but her eyes held light again. "I am still here," she said quietly, and the sound of her voice startled her. She stayed there for several minutes, until the cold began to reach through her boots. Then she turned and began the slow walk back toward the castle. The snow gave way beneath her in soft sighs, each step sinking slightly deeper, as if the earth itself wished to keep her near. At the base of the terrace, she paused once more and looked up at Windsor's towers, their stone now glistening in the sun. For the first time, they did not seem like a tomb, but like the ribs of something vast and living, a house awakening. When she re-entered the castle, the warmth struck her gently, not as an escape but as a welcome. Her maids hurried to take her cloak, their eyes wide at the color in her cheeks. She smiled faintly. "The storm is over," she said. "See that the chapel bells ring before nightfall." And as she climbed the stairs to her rooms, her footsteps sounded lighter, almost young again, the echo of a woman returning, not from mourning, but from the long sleep of winter itself. The fire had been lit early that evening, its light filling the Queen's study with a muted amber glow. The thaw had reached the castle grounds, but the air still carried the scent of cold stone and melting snow. Outside, Windsor's lawns shone faintly beneath a pale moon, streaked with the dark veins of running water. Inside, all was still. The Queen sat at her writing desk once more, not to write to ministers, nor to record her thoughts for the archives of state, but to write a final letter that would never leave the room. The desk was crowded with papers, each one carefully stacked, each one sealed and labeled in her own small, precise hand. Yet before her now lay only a single sheet. The ink bottle steamed faintly beside the fire. The pen trembled slightly between her fingers. She began without ceremony, the words flowing with an ease that startled her. "My dearest, my constant." She paused, the pen hovering. The title felt both sacred and foolish, as if she were addressing the ghost that had followed her for more than 2 decades. "Still," she continued, "it is the winter of my old age, and I find myself surrounded by silence again. The snow is melting, and with it, the last of the frost that has lived in me. I have tried to rule with reason, to endure with dignity, but every day I am reminded that I am still only half of what I was. You were the courage, I was the reflection, and now the mirror begins to fade." The pen scratched faintly as she wrote, the sound soft as falling ash. The fire snapped once, scattering a brief cascade of sparks up the chimney. They say time heals all wounds, but it does not. Time teaches you to walk with them. I have carried mine long enough. You will forgive me, I think, if I long for the warmth of the hand I once held, and if I choose now to let the silence have the last word. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully. Her hands did not tremble now. She rose and went to the hearth. The coals glowed deep red beneath the logs, a slow, patient light that reminded her of heartbeats. She hesitated only a moment before feeding the letter into the flame. The fire caught it instantly. The paper curled inward, blackening at the edges, the ink dissolving into smoke. For a few seconds, the words glowed in reverse white against darkness before vanishing altogether, the air filled with the faint, sweet scent of burning paper. The Queen watched without flinching. The letter had been her last conversation with him, her final indulgence in a dialogue that had spanned the divide between life and death. She felt neither grief nor relief as it vanished, only a strange stillness, like the pause after a deep breath. When the last corner of the letter had turned to ash, she bent down and stirred the coals gently with the poker. The embers flared briefly, then settled into quiet red folds. She touched the iron to the grate, its warmth biting through the fabric of her glove. "There," she whispered. "It is done." Her maid found her later still sitting before the fire, the poker laid neatly beside her, her eyes reflecting the dying glow. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "shall I add another log?" Victoria shook her head. "No," she replied. "Let it rest. The room is warm enough now." When the maid had gone, The Queen leaned forward, opening her hands toward the embers. The last bits of ash drifted upward and vanished. She imagined, for a fleeting moment, that they rose beyond the chimney, beyond the grey sky, beyond time itself, carrying her words where they had always meant to go. The coals dimmed, the room fell silent. Yet for the first time in years, she did not feel the cold. Morning came with an unfamiliar brightness, not the blinding glare of frost, nor the sterile sheen of snow, but something gentler, a light that seemed to have warmth stitched into it. The sun climbed slowly over Windsor's towers, gilding their stone faces with pale gold. The ice that had gripped the gutters began to drip, and the sound of water, clean, steady, forgiving, echoed softly through the courtyards. The Queen awoke before the servants came, her room bathed in that new light. It startled her at first. The windows had not glowed like that in months. The frost along the panes had retreated, leaving clear glass streaked with the faint residue of melted patterns. She could see, for the first time in weeks, the outline of trees swaying beyond the walls, their dark branches gleaming with dew. Somewhere, faint and uncertain, a bird was singing. When her maid entered, she froze in the doorway. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "The sky, it's blue again." Victoria turned her head toward the window. "So it is," she said. "It feels almost indecent." The maid laughed softly, surprised to hear her tone not sharp, not heavy, but light, almost amused. The Queen rose and moved to the glass, her hand brushing its cool surface. The world looked softer now. The endless white had given way to color-muted browns, fragile greens, hints of earth and air. She had forgotten how gentle the palette of the living could be. After breakfast, she asked to be dressed in something other than black. The request fell into the silence of the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Her attendants exchanged uncertain glances. "Perhaps the grey silk, ma'am?" one ventured, hesitant. "Yes," she said simply, "the grey." It was not defiance, it was curiosity. When they draped the fabric over her shoulders, it caught the light, the faintest shimmer of silver where the folds curved. The Queen studied her reflection in the mirror and did not look away. Her face was as lined and pale as ever, but the change of color softened her, made her less statue, more woman. That afternoon, she walked again in the garden. The snow had receded to the edges, the paths glistening with wet stone. The air smelled of thawing soil and cedar. Every few steps, she stopped to look at a cluster of moss emerging from under ice, at the faint blush of rose stems that had survived the freeze. Then, near the fountain, she saw it, a small bird, red-breasted and bright against the muted earth. A robin. It hopped along the rim of the basin, pecking at the thawing ice, unconcerned by her presence. Its color seemed impossible after so much white, a single heartbeat of flame against the gray. She watched it for several minutes, her breath catching once, briefly, as if the world had surprised her by being alive. When it finally flew off toward the chapel roof, she smiled not widely, but enough that her eyes changed. "It seems even God has grown, weary of mourning," she murmured. The servants who followed her at a distance noted the smile and spoke of it in the kitchens later, quietly, almost reverently. It spread through the household faster than rumor, faster even than warmth. The Queen had smiled again. That evening, she ordered the curtains of the great hall drawn back to let in the last of the sunset. The light poured in a soft blaze of amber and rose, painting the once frozen walls in color. The servants paused in their duties to watch as the dying sun set Windsor aglow. Upstairs, Victoria stood at her window, her grey gown glowing like the feathers of a dove. She pressed her hand once more against the glass and whispered, "He would have loved this." Below her, the river gleamed with movement again, the ice drifting away in glittering shards. The world, for the first time in many long months, was no longer still, and neither, at last, was she. By the final week of winter, the sound of dripping water had replaced the wind. It fell steadily from the eaves and the statues, from the gargoyles that once spat snow. The earth beneath Windsor was soft again, dark patches of soil showing through the grass where the sun lingered longest. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and thawing moss, the scent of a world waking up. The Queen's days began to take on rhythm again. She rose earlier, walked longer, and dined not in silence but with company. The household had learned to speak softly around her again, cautiously at first, as though every word might break the fragile peace she carried now. But she did not scold them. Once, she might have withdrawn from their chatter, finding the noise an insult to grief. Now, she listened. That morning, she took her tea in the orangery, a room she had not entered since Albert's death. It had been his favourite retreat. Warm, even in the coldest months, its air thick with the faint sweetness of soil and citrus leaves. The gardeners had reopened it after the storm, pruning the frost-bitten branches and coaxing the little trees back to life. Their waxy leaves trembled faintly in the light that filtered through the glass. Victoria sat alone at first, breathing in the scent of earth. It was richer than she remembered, alive in a way that made her throat tighten. For years she had fled such places, afraid of life's insistence on continuing without him. But now she saw it differently, not defiance, but devotion. The world, she realized, does not move on. It carries forward what it can. Her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, entered quietly, her face flushed from the walk. She hesitated by the doorway. "May I join you, Mama?" Victoria looked up and smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. Bring your embroidery." Beatrice sat near her mother, careful not to disturb the peace. They spoke little. The Queen watched as her daughter's needle moved through fabric, the slow rhythm of creation matching the drip of meltwater outside. It was the kind of moment that had vanished from her life. Simple, domestic, human. "I dreamt of him last night," the Queen said suddenly, her voice low but clear. "He was standing in the garden by the fountain. The ice had gone, and he was laughing." Beatrice set down her sewing. "Was it like before?" "No," Victoria said, after a pause. "It was better. He looked as he does in my memory, but lighter, as if he had been freed of weight. He didn't speak. He only looked at me, and I understood." "What did you understand?" "That he never meant for me to build a tomb of him." She exhaled softly, as if releasing years of held breath. "I have been living inside winter for too long." Beatrice reached over and placed her hand gently atop her mother's. Victoria did not pull away. For the first time in decades, her fingers felt warm against another's skin. Outside, the robins were louder that day. The gardeners paused their work to listen as a chorus of birds filled the air, tentative at first, then bold, their song echoing through the glass walls of the orangery. The Queen rose from her chair and moved to the window. The sun had climbed higher, washing the grounds in pale gold. Streams ran freely through the gardens now, carving new paths through the snow's remains. "Order the ballroom cleaned," she said softly, still gazing outside. "We will open the windows and let the air in again." Beatrice blinked. "The ballroom, Mama?" "Yes. It is time for light to return there too." The princess smiled through tears. "He would like that." "I believe," Victoria said, her reflection bright against the glass. "He already does." That evening, when the staff entered the ballroom with brooms and lanterns, the air inside was sharp with cold but full of promise. Dust rose like mist in the slanting sunlight, and in the center of the room, the Queen's faint footprints crossed the floorboards, a trail leading toward the grand windows, where light spilled in, patient and golden, as if waiting for her return. Night fell gently over Windsor, not with the cruel suddenness of winter, but with the gradual hush of early spring. The air outside had softened. The wind no longer clawed at the windows, but sighed through the chimneys like a lullaby. In the great hall, the fires had burned down to coals, and the smell of beeswax and smoke hung low in the air. The Queen's household moved quietly through the corridors, snuffing out lamps, drawing curtains, and preparing the castle for sleep. Yet, in the Queen's private study, one light remained. It came from a single candle, tall, slender, its flame trembling but unyielding. It stood upon her writing desk beside the small rosewood music box, now silent, and the brooch Albert had given her long ago, resting on folded letters that no longer needed to be written. The candle's glow wrapped the room in a soft warmth that the hearth could not give. It illuminated the Queen's face, still and contemplative, her eyes reflecting the flame as though they had borrowed a piece of its light. Victoria sat with her hands folded upon her lap. She wore the same grey gown she had chosen that morning, no crown, no veil, only the faint gleam of the brooch against her heart. The thaw had brought colour back to her world, but this hour belonged to quiet. She had always loved the final stillness of night, when the duties of the day fell away and the world expected nothing of her. In the silence, she could feel the weight of her own breathing, the gentle rise and fall that reminded her she was still here, still bound to the rhythm of life. On the table beside the candle lay her journal, closed but not yet put away. Its last written line, completed just before dusk, read, "The frost has melted. The air smells of rain. Perhaps tomorrow I shall begin again." The clock struck 11. The chime was slow and heavy, echoing through the stone halls like footsteps fading down a corridor. She did not flinch at the sound. She had learned, over the years, to mark time not by clocks, but by seasons, by the slow change of light across her window. And this season, she knew, was different. The grief that had once felt endless had begun to loosen its hold, not vanishing, but transforming, like ice turning quietly back to water. Her thoughts drifted to the garden. She pictured the fountain now free of its frozen shell, the robin's red breast flashing as it darted between branches, the faint shimmer of water reflecting the pale moon. The world was still cold, but alive again. She smiled faintly at the thought. The candle flickered, leaning to one side as if bowing. She reached forward and steadied it with her hand. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "You and I will see it through." Behind her the fire sank lower. Shadows thickened in the corners of the room, soft and velvety. The Queen sat very still, her gaze fixed upon the little flame. It wavered once more, then grew steady, a single bright thread of gold in a sea of dimness. She thought of Albert then, not as the ghost who had haunted her corridors for so many winters, but as the light that had guided her back toward warmth. He had been the first candle, she realized, the one whose fire had kindled all the others. And she, after all these years, had kept that light alive. The room was utterly silent now. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wax. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the flame. "Good night, my love," she murmured. "The night is kind again." When the servants entered at dawn, the fire had gone out. The candle, burned nearly to the end, still stood upright, its wick a single thread of smoke rising toward the ceiling. On the Queen's desk, the brooch caught the first sunlight of the new day, its pearl glimmering faintly in the pale gold light. Outside, the robins sang. The last frost had melted from the gardens, and in the highest window of Windsor Castle, where that candle had burned through every storm, the glass reflected the morning bright, gentle, and unbroken.